the desert does not begin as a desert. Before the dunes harden into the pale horizons familiar today, before the Nile becomes the narrow green spine of a kingdom, northern Africa is changing under a sky still carrying the long after effects of the Ice Age. Rain arrives farther north than it does now. Seasonal streams cut across ground that will one day look lifeless. Shallow lakes spread into basins where only salt, dust, and silence will remain. Herds move through open grassland. Fish gather in waters that will later vanish completely. Small human groups follow this shifting abundance, not as rulers of a hidden empire, but as expert readers of a landscape that rewards attention and punishes certainty. This is the world before the pharaohs, before hieroglyphs, before palaces, before the first king could imagine ruling both banks of the Nile. No state controls Egypt. No capital commands the desert. There is no single civilization waiting fully formed beneath the sands. What exists instead is a mosaic of communities learning how to live with unstable water, scattered resources, long distances, and a climate that never remains generous for very long. Their tools are small, their shelters leave faint traces, their names are lost, yet the habits they develop mobility, cooperation, storage, seasonal planning, animal knowledge, ritual gathering, and exchange across wide spaces will become part of the deep foundation from which Egyptian civilization later emerges. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, around the end of the last ice age, the climate of North Africa begins to shift. This does not happen in a single season, and it does not transform the whole Sahara at once. Rain belts move gradually. Monsoon systems strengthen and push northward. Some regions become greener sooner than others, while certain basins remain dry or only briefly wet. The result is not one vast uniform savanna, but a patchwork of lakes, marshes, grasslands, rocky uplands, temporary rivers, and still arid zones. The people living within this patchwork must understand not only where water is, but when it will be there, how long it will last, and what signs reveal that it is beginning to fail. What survives in the archaeological record suggests communities that are highly mobile but not aimless. They move according to patterns. They return to places where springs persist, where lake margins hold fish, where wild grasses ripen, and where stone suitable for tools can be found. A site may be occupied for part of a year and abandoned when conditions change, only to be used again generations later. To modern eyes, such movement can look temporary. Yet mobility is not the absence of organization. In this environment, it is organization, built on memory passed from one generation to the next. The Eastern Sahara, including areas west of the Nile, becomes especially important in this story. Today, much of it appears empty, but the apparent emptiness is deceptive. Beneath the surface lie hearths, fragments of pottery, grinding stones, animal bones, post holes, buried pits, and the outlines of ancient camps. These remains are modest. There are no inscriptions announcing rulers and no royal tombs filled with gold. Archaeologists must reconstruct life from traces moved by wind, buried by sand, or disturbed by thousands of years of erosion. The evidence remains incomplete, and entire communities may have disappeared without leaving more than a scatter of chipped stone. Even so, the pattern challenges an old assumption that civilization began only when people settled permanently beside a great river. Long before the Nile Valley became the center of political power, human groups across the surrounding deserts were experimenting with ways to reduce risk. They dug for water. They returned to dependable basins. They processed wild plants. They learned the behavior of animals. They exchanged materials over distances too great to be explained by isolated wandering. None of this is a state, but all of it requires knowledge, coordination, and social trust. The Nile is already present, of course, but it is not yet the fully organized corridor of fields, towns, temples, and administrative districts known from later Egypt. Its floodplain is dynamic, channels shift, wetlands spread. Seasonal floods create fertile ground but also uncertainty. In some periods, the river attracts people. In others, lakes and grasslands farther west offer better opportunities. The relationship between desert and river is therefore not one way. People do not simply wait in the wilderness until the Nile calls them inward. They move through overlapping worlds, sometimes using the valley, sometimes the oases, sometimes distant basins where rainfall briefly creates abundance. This wider geography matters because later Egyptian history often makes the Nile seem like the only meaningful landscape. The monuments encourage that illusion. Pyramids, temples, tombs, and cities cluster along the river, and the desert beyond appears as a border, a place of danger or burial. But before the rise of the state, the desert is not merely outside Egypt. It is one of the places where communities develop skills that later prove essential reading seasons. Organizing group labor, locating groundwater, traveling between distant resources, and building identities around shared places. One lesser-known detail is how much of early North African life depended on landscapes that no longer exist at all. Entire lakes vanished. Marshes turned to dust. Shorelines retreated beyond recognition. Archaeological sites that once stood beside water now sit in extreme aridity, creating the strange impression that people had chosen to camp in impossible places. They had not. The world changed around the remains they left behind. The map seen by archaeologists is not the map known by the people who lived there. Climatic improvement brings opportunity, but it also brings instability. Recent research on the African humid period shows that even during broadly wetter millennia, droughts interrupted the pattern. Around 9,300 years ago, again near 8,200 years ago, and perhaps around 6,300 years ago. Rainfall weakened sharply in parts of the Sahara. These dry episodes were not identical everywhere, and evidence from one lake cannot describe the whole continent. Still, they reveal a crucial truth. The Green Sahara is not a lost paradise that remains unchanged for thousands of years. It is a shifting environment in which abundance can retreat within a lifetime. Such uncertainty shapes human behavior. A community that depends on one lake alone is vulnerable. A community that knows several water sources, maintains ties with distant groups, and can shift between fishing, gathering, hunting, and herding has more options. Over long periods, flexibility becomes a form of wealth. Knowledge becomes a form of inheritance. A route remembered through dry country may be more valuable than any object. A shared ritual place or exchange partnership can help people survive when one region fails. There is no reason to imagine these communities as primitive rehearsals for later greatness. They live complete lives within their own worlds. Yet history often works through accumulation. Skills developed for one purpose become useful for another. Practices shaped by seasonal camps can influence later settlement. Shared gatherings can create wider identities. Exchange networks can become channels for crops, animals, technologies, and symbols. The first steps toward complexity do not always look dramatic when they happen. Far in the future, kings will claim control over the Nile and the lands beyond it. They will present unity as natural, ancient, and divinely ordered. But the deeper record tells a quieter story. Egypt is not prepared by one forgotten civilization. It is prepared by many communities, living across riverbanks, deserts, wetlands, and oases, adapting in different ways and at different speeds. Their world is not yet Egypt as history remembers it. It is a landscape of possibilities, held together by water, movement, and memory, and the rains are only beginning to remake it. As the rains move northward, the Sahara begins to fill with contradictions. Places that will later become symbols of emptiness now hold grass, reeds, shallow lakes, and seasonal streams. Herds of wild cattle move across open country. Antelope, gazelle, and other grazing animals follow corridors of vegetation. Waterbirds gather along lake margins. Fish survive in basins that seem impossibly distant from any river today. The landscape is neither forest nor desert in the modern sense, but a broad, shifting zone where life expands and contracts with the reach of the monsoon. This wetter interval is often called the African humid period, although the phrase can sound more stable than the reality. It begins roughly 14,800 years ago and reaches its most favourable phase between about 9,000 and 6,000 years ago. Yet the change does not arrive evenly. Some basins fill while others remain unreliable. Rainfall varies from one region to another. Vegetation spreads in pulses. Long wet phases are interrupted by severe dry episodes. A map drawn for one century may be misleading for the next. For the communities moving through this world, climate is not an abstract pattern measured in sediment cores. It is the difference between a lake that lasts through the dry season and one that disappears too early. It determines whether wild grasses produce enough seed, whether animals remain nearby, and whether a familiar route can still be crossed. People must respond not only to average conditions, but to surprises. A few failed rainy seasons can force a camp to relocate. A newly filled basin can attract groups from distant regions. A dependable spring can become the centre of repeated occupation and perhaps a place of social importance. The Sahara's greening creates opportunities for movement across areas that later become formidable barriers. Routes open between the Nile Valley, the Central Sahara, the Maghreb, the Sahel, and regions farther south. These are not roads, and there is no organized system directing traffic, but people, animals, materials, and ideas can travel through connected zones of water and pasture. Stone from one region may appear far away. Pottery styles can share features across wide distances. Techniques of hunting, food processing, and eventually herding spread through contact between communities that are mobile but not isolated. The importance of this mobility is easy to underestimate because later civilizations leave cities, archives, and monumental roads. Mobile societies leave lighter traces. A hearth may survive as a dark stain. A seasonal shelter may leave only post holes. A campsite occupied for several weeks might produce a scatter of stone tools and animal bones, while a place revisited over centuries can appear more substantial without ever becoming a permanent settlement. Archaeologists must distinguish between repeated return and continuous residence, and that distinction is not always clear. What survives suggests that different groups used the landscape in different ways. Some depended heavily on fishing and aquatic resources. Others followed game or harvested wild plants. Some combined several strategies, moving according to seasonal abundance. This flexibility allowed people to exploit a region whose resources were widespread but rarely dependable in one place throughout the year. the Green Sahara supported more human activity than the modern desert, but it did not remove the need for careful planning. One of the most surprising features of this world is how familiar some of its environments would have seemed to people living much farther south today. Fossil pollen, lake sediments, animal remains, and ancient soils show that vegetation zones once extended hundreds of kilometers north of their modern limits. Grasslands and shrublands occupied areas now covered by dunes or gravel plains. Large mammals ranged through territories where almost no wild herd could survive today. Rock art from later phases preserves images of animals associated with water and savanna, although the dating of individual images is often difficult and should not be treated as a simple visual calendar. Human presence follows these ecological openings. Along lake edges, people can fish, collect shellfish, trap small animals, gather edible plants, and hunt larger game drawn to water. Dry uplands provide stone and vantage points. Seasonal wetlands concentrate resources but also bring insects, dangerous animals, and changing shorelines. The landscape offers abundance, but not comfort in any modern sense. Shelter is temporary, storage is limited, and every year requires renewed attention to rainfall. The evidence remains incomplete because wet environments do not always preserve occupation clearly. Shorelines shift, sediments bury camps, later erosion exposes and destroys them, wind scatters lightweight material. In some regions, modern remoteness makes large-scale archaeological survey difficult. As a result, the known sites are only fragments of a much larger human geography. Entire routes of movement may remain invisible. Still, broad patterns emerge. People repeatedly occupy favoured basins. They develop increasingly specialised toolkits. Grinding equipment suggests the processing of seeds and other plant foods. Pottery appears in parts of the Sahara before full agricultural village life develops along the Nile. This is important because pottery is often associated in popular imagination with settled farmers, yet early pottery can also serve mobile communities. Containers help boil food, process plants, store liquids, and make difficult resources more useful. A technological innovation does not require a city, and it does not automatically indicate political hierarchy. The communities of the wetter Sahara are therefore neither simple wanderers nor members of a lost empire. They occupy a middle ground that modern categories often fail to capture. They can be mobile and highly organized, dispersed yet connected, dependent on wild resources while experimenting with new technologies. Their social worlds may extend across territories much larger than a single camp. Marriages, exchange partnerships, seasonal gatherings, and shared ritual practices could link groups separated for much of the year. Though such relationships are difficult to reconstruct directly, the changing climate may also strengthen the value of memory. A place where water survived during an earlier drought would be remembered. Routes between basins would carry stories as well as people. Knowledge of stars, winds, animal movements, and seasonal plants could guide travel. But claims about precise astronomical systems must remain cautious. Practical observation of the sky does not require formal science in the later sense. It requires attention, repetition, and the ability to connect celestial patterns with changes on the ground. Periods of drought interrupt this developing world. Around 9,300 years ago, rainfall weakens sharply in parts of the Sahara. Another major disruption occurs near 8,200 years ago, linked to broader climatic changes across the northern hemisphere. Some regions recover, others remain drier. Communities may abandon certain basins, intensify use of others, or alter the timing of their movements. No single explanation fully accounts for every local response, because the Sahara is too large and environmentally varied to behave as one system. These interruptions matter because adaptation often accelerates under pressure. People who already move seasonally may extend their routes. Groups that once relied mainly on hunting and gathering may place greater importance on managed animals. Communities may deepen wells, return more frequently to reliable water sources, or strengthen ties with neighbours. Environmental stress does not automatically produce social complexity, and it can also cause dispersal or decline. Yet it creates conditions in which cooperation, inherited knowledge, and access to dependable places become increasingly important. The Green Sahara is therefore not merely a scenic prelude to Egyptian history. It is a vast arena of human experimentation. Across its lakes, grasslands, and seasonal corridors, communities learn how to organize life around uncertainty. They discover that survival depends not on controlling the entire landscape, but on understanding its rhythms better than the next dry season can disrupt them. Among the most revealing traces of that adaptation will appear far to the west of the Nile, at a place where ancient water once gathered in the Egyptian desert and where fragments of pottery, hearths, wells, and stone structures begin to preserve a more detailed human story. The place is called Nabta Playa, although the name now describes a landscape almost stripped of the thing that once made it possible. A playa is a basin where water gathers temporarily, and today the basin lies in the western desert of Egypt, far from the river and deep within a region that appears almost incapable of supporting sustained human life. Yet thousands of years ago, seasonal rain collected here. Shallow water spread across the depression. Grasses grew around its margins. Animals came to drink. Human groups returned again and again, leaving behind one of the richest records of early Holocene life in the Egyptian Sahara. To reach Nabta Playa now is to travel through an environment so dry that the ancient occupation can seem almost unreal. There are no surviving reeds, no visible shoreline, and no permanent village rising from the sand. The evidence lies low to the ground: fragments of pottery, chipped stone, grinding equipment, hearths, animal bones, pits, post holes, wells, and arrangements of stone whose meanings are still debated. None of these traces is grand by the standards of later Egypt. Together, however, they reveal a place repeatedly used over millennia by communities whose lives depended on reading water, season, and distance with extraordinary precision. The earliest occupations belong to a time around 10,000 to 9,000 years ago, during a phase archaeologists often associate with the El Adam cultural horizon. The people arriving here are still primarily hunters, gatherers, and seasonal travellers. They do not live in a city, and there is no evidence of kings, taxation, bureaucracy, or territorial rule. Their shelters are light. Their camps may last only as long as water and food remain available. Yet the remains show that their visits are organised rather than accidental. Hearths indicate repeated cooking and gathering. Stone tools reveal cutting, scraping, and hunting activities. Grinding stones suggest that plant foods require substantial processing. Most strikingly, fragments of early pottery appear in secure archaeological contexts. These vessels are among the important pieces of evidence for early ceramic technology in the Western Desert. They show that pottery is present before the fully established farming villages, often associated with later Neolithic life in Egypt. This does not mean that Nabta Playa is an early agricultural city. The distinction matters. Pottery can serve mobile communities just as effectively as settled ones, especially when camps are revisited and travel follows known seasonal routes. A ceramic container can hold water, cook seeds, soften tough plant material, render animal fat, or prepare foods that cannot easily be processed over an open flame. The invention or adoption of pottery changes what people can eat and how they can store or share it, but it does not by itself create a state. Archaeobotanical evidence provides a closer view of what these people consume. Charred seeds, fruits, and other plant remains show the exploitation of a wide range of wild species, especially grasses and small seeds. Gathering these foods demands detailed knowledge. Different plants ripen at different moments. Some grow only near water, others survive on drier ground. Seeds must be collected, cleaned, ground, and cooked. The quantities recovered are small compared with later agricultural deposits, but they reveal a broad subsistence strategy designed for flexibility. That flexibility is one of Nabta Playa's central lessons. The people who use the basin do not rely on a single resource. They hunt, gather, process plants, and later place increasing emphasis on animals that may have been managed or herded. They shift their activities as the environment changes. In wetter years, the basin offers water and vegetation. In drier years, survival depends on deeper knowledge of springs, groundwater, and alternative routes. What appears to be a marginal landscape is made habitable through accumulated experience. Water management becomes especially visible in the evidence for wells. Digging a well in a desert basin requires more than physical effort. It requires confidence that water lies below the surface, knowledge of where to dig, and cooperation sufficient to maintain access. A well can extend the usable season beyond the brief life of a rain pool. It can transform a temporary stop into a recurring centre. It can also create social obligations, because water that many people depend upon must be shared, guarded, maintained, or negotiated. Scholars still debate how permanent some occupations were and how large the visiting groups became. The remains of huts and activity areas do not necessarily indicate continuous year-round residence. Repeated seasonal use can produce dense deposits that resemble a settlement. The evidence remains incomplete because wind erosion removes upper layers and shifts lighter materials. Even so, the repeated return to the same basin suggests that Nabta Playa is more than an accidental campsite. It becomes a known place within a wider network of movement. That wider network may have stretched across large parts of the Eastern Sahara. Stone types, pottery traditions, animal management practices, and other cultural similarities suggest contact among groups moving between basins and perhaps toward the Nile Valley. Yet direct lines of descent are difficult to prove. It would be too simple to imagine one Nabta community packing its belongings, marching east, and becoming the founders of pharaonic Egypt. Human movements are rarely so neat. Groups split, merge, exchange partners, borrow technologies, and change their identities over generations. The basin also preserves evidence of communal activity that seems to exceed the needs of daily subsistence. In later phases, stones are placed upright or arranged into circles and alignments. Some cattle are buried in carefully prepared contexts. These features suggest that Nabta Playa becomes a place of gathering, memory, and ritual, not merely food collection. The treatment of cattle is especially revealing because it indicates that animals can carry social and symbolic value beyond meat or milk. Cattle in the Sahara have long stood at the centre of debate. Archaeologists have argued over whether some early remains represent local domestication, managed wild animals, or cattle introduced through broader networks. The evidence varies by site and date, and no single explanation resolves every case. By the Middle and later Holocene, however, pastoral lifeways are clearly becoming important across parts of North Africa. At Nabta Playa, cattle eventually become deeply woven into community identity and ceremony. The stone arrangements have attracted even more speculation. Popular accounts often describe Nabta Playa as the world's oldest astronomical observatory, sometimes implying precise scientific knowledge later inherited by the builders of the pyramids. The surviving evidence supports a more careful interpretation. Some stones may relate to seasonal observation, the position of the sun, the coming of rains, or the organization of ritual space. People who depend on seasonal water would have every reason to watch the sky closely, but the exact function, dating, and intended precision of individual structures remain disputed. It is possible that certain alignments helped mark recurring moments in the year. It is also possible that some stones served commemorative, territorial, funerary, or ceremonial purposes. These functions need not be mutually exclusive. A place can organize time, memory, and community at once. What should be avoided is the assumption that every alignment is an observatory, or that Nabta possessed a formal astronomical institution comparable to those of later states. The real significance of the site does not require exaggeration. Nabta Playa shows that mobile and semi-mobile communities can create durable places in landscapes where their shelters remain temporary. They return to the same basin, invest labor in wells, prepare food with pottery and grinding stones, organize communal activities, and eventually build symbolic features that outlast any single season. Permanence begins not with stone houses, but with repeated attention. The basin also reveals how archaeology recovers people whose lives leave no written names. A burned seed becomes evidence of diet. A post hole suggests shelter. A cluster of stones marks a working area or gathering place. A buried animal hints at belief. Each clue is small, and each interpretation carries uncertainty. Yet together they allow a vanished lake to reappear in outline. At the water's edge, smoke rises from hearths. Seeds are ground against stone. Vessels sit near the fire. Animals move across the grass beyond the camp. People arrive from routes invisible on the modern map, carrying tools, knowledge, and news from other places. They may remain for weeks or months before the water contracts and movement begins again. Their world is not yet built around fields or permanent towns, but they are already learning how a place can be returned to, improved, remembered, and shared. That lesson will become increasingly important as the climate grows less predictable. Wells, roots, animals, and communal gathering will matter more. The desert communities will not respond in one uniform way, but across the Sahara, cattle and water begin to shape new patterns of survival. Nabta Playa preserves the moment when mobility becomes tied to favoured places, and when a seasonal basin begins to hold something more enduring than a camp, the memory of a community. A remembered basin is useful, but a remembered route between basins can mean survival. As communities return to Nabta Playa and other favoured places across the eastern Sahara, their world increasingly depends on movement through long stretches of uncertain country. Water remains the fixed point around which everything else turns. Grass appears and disappears. Herds shift their range. Lakes shrink. Springs fail. A group that knows only one source is fragile. A group that knows how several sources connect can endure. Cattle gradually become part of this wider strategy. Their arrival in the archaeological record is often presented as a simple turning point, as though hunters suddenly become herders and the old way of life ends. The evidence suggests something slower and more complicated. For long periods, communities continue to hunt, fish, gather plants, and process wild seeds even while cattle become increasingly important. Different groups adopt animal management at different times. Some may keep small herds while remaining highly mobile. Others may depend more heavily on wild resources. Pastoralism does not replace every older practice. It is added to an already flexible system. The origins of cattle management in northeastern Africa remain debated. Some scholars have argued for very early local domestication or control of wild cattle in the Sahara. Others see stronger evidence for domesticated cattle arriving through connections with regions farther east. Animal bones are difficult to interpret when wild and early domestic cattle overlap in size, and the presence of cattle remains does not automatically prove herding. Context, age patterns, body proportions, and the relationship between animals and human activity must all be considered. No single explanation fully accounts for every early site. By the Middle Holocene, however, cattle are clearly more than occasional prey in many Saharan communities. They travel with people, shape seasonal decisions, and become sources of meat, milk, hides, bone, status, and social identity. A herd is mobile wealth, but it is also a demanding responsibility. Animals need water more regularly than humans can sometimes afford. They require pasture. They must be protected from predators, illness, and loss. A family or community that keeps cattle is tied to the condition of the landscape in a new way. This creates a different rhythm of movement. Hunters may follow wild animals toward temporary concentrations. Herders must anticipate where grazing will remain available and where water can support both people and livestock. They cannot simply arrive after the rain. They must judge whether grass will last, whether a well can be reopened, and whether the route ahead is safe enough for weakened animals. Seasonal mobility becomes a planned circuit rather than an improvised search. Wells therefore gain even greater importance. A natural pool may support people briefly, but cattle can drain limited water quickly. Digging into a dry basin to reach groundwater extends the useful life of a place. Maintaining such access requires labour. Sand collapses into shafts, mud accumulates, edges must be reinforced. Water must be drawn repeatedly, and perhaps shared among groups arriving at different times. Even without formal ownership, a well can become a centre of obligation, negotiation, and memory. The people who dig and maintain these wells leave little written evidence of how access is organised. Archaeology can reveal the feature but not the full social rules surrounding it. Perhaps certain families claim inherited rights. Perhaps water is shared during seasonal gatherings. Perhaps disputes occur when rainfall is poor. What survives in the record suggests cooperation, but cooperation does not mean the absence of tension. Scarcity can strengthen alliances and expose divisions at the same time. Cattle may help communities bridge these uncertain landscapes because animals transform grass into portable nourishment. They can carry value across distance in a way that gathered plants cannot. Yet the idea of a herd as simple insurance is misleading. During drought, cattle become vulnerable precisely when people need them most. Water shortages reduce pasture, weaken animals, and force longer journeys. A herd can preserve wealth through one difficult season and collapse during a more severe one. Pastoral life rewards knowledge, but it never eliminates risk. That knowledge includes close observation of vegetation. Herders must recognize which grasses recover quickly after rain, which plants harm animals, and which low areas retain moisture after the surface appears dry. They watch animal behavior for signs of thirst or exhaustion. They learn when calves can travel and when movement must slow. They may split herds, sending some animals toward distant pasture while others remain near a dependable water source. Such decisions require coordination across households and generations. The same routes that move cattle also move information. When groups meet near wells or seasonal lakes, they exchange news about rainfall, pasture, illness, distant resources, and other communities. They may trade stone, ornaments, pottery, skins, food, or animals. Marriage ties can link groups using different territories. Ritual gatherings can renew relationships that are essential during crisis. A community with allies in several regions possesses a wider map of survival than one living alone. This is one reason pastoralism should not be understood only as an economic change. Cattle become social beings within human communities. They can mark wealth, generosity, ancestry, and prestige. Their ownership may influence marriage arrangements and obligations. Their slaughter can feed gatherings too large for ordinary household resources. Their burial in carefully prepared settings suggests that certain animals possess significance beyond daily consumption. At Nabta Playa and related sites, cattle burials are among the most striking evidence of this symbolic importance. Animals are sometimes placed in pits with deliberate care rather than discarded as food waste. Such treatment requires labour and the sacrifice of a valuable resource. The precise meaning is unknown. The burials may honour particular animals, commemorate communal events, express relationships with ancestors, or connect cattle with seasonal renewal and water. Scholars still debate the beliefs behind these acts because no text explains them. Yet their existence shows that pastoral life changes the way communities imagine themselves. Animals that travel with people through difficult country become part of collective memory. A herd represents more than food. It embodies successful movement between pastures, survival through drought, and continuity between generations. When a valued animal is buried, the act may bind a community to a place in much the same way as a stone arrangement or a maintained well. The seasonal gathering of several groups around water could also create moments of unusual social intensity. Most of the year, communities may live in smaller units spread across wide territories. When rains fill a basin, people converge, herds gather, food is processed in larger quantities, tools are repaired, partnerships are renewed, ceremonies may take place, information travels quickly. For a brief period, a sparse landscape becomes crowded. These gatherings do not make Nabta Playa a city. There are no permanent streets, administrative buildings, or institutions capable of governing a large territory. But temporary concentration can still encourage complex organization. People must arrange space, manage animals, share water, and coordinate activities. Repeated gatherings can establish traditions and leadership roles. Individuals skilled in negotiation, ritual, environmental knowledge, or herd management may gain influence without becoming kings. This is one of the deeper continuities between desert life and later societies along the Nile. Large-scale civilization does not emerge because nomads suddenly discover permanence. It grows partly from practices already familiar in mobile worlds, planning around seasonal cycles, assembling dispersed communities, coordinating labor, maintaining shared resources, and turning animals or rare goods into social authority. These practices are not uniquely Egyptian, and they do not lead inevitably to a state, but they form part of the human experience from which larger political systems can later develop. The climate continues to place pressure on these arrangements. Wet years can expand pasture and allow communities to spread. Dry years concentrate people at fewer dependable sources. Repeated droughts may strengthen the importance of wells and alliances while making competition more dangerous. Some groups move farther south or west. Others increase their use of the Nile corridor. Still others remain in desert basins as long as local conditions allow. There is no single migration that carries all Saharan communities into Egypt at once. Movement occurs in pulses, over centuries, and in many directions. People bring different traditions with them. They meet communities already living near the Nile. They exchange animals, crops, techniques, and symbols. Some practices disappear. Others are transformed. The population that eventually inhabits Predynastic Egypt is shaped by this mixture, not by one founding people. For now, the desert still supports movement. Cattle walk between patches of grass. Wells are opened in familiar basins. Smoke rises again from hearths used by earlier generations. The communities crossing this landscape do not control nature, but they have learned how to negotiate with its uncertainty. Their roots form an invisible architecture across the Sahara, built not from walls, but from water, pasture, memory, and trust. Soon, those roots will also lead toward gatherings where animals, stones, sky, and ancestry begin to merge into something more difficult to explain. The gathering place begins to hold more than water. People return because the basin is useful. But usefulness alone does not explain why certain animals are buried with care, why heavy stones are moved into deliberate positions, or why particular areas remain important across generations. At Nabta Playa and other desert sites, survival and ceremony appear to overlap. The same landscape that provides pasture and seasonal water also becomes a place where communities mark time, memory, identity, and perhaps their relationship with powers beyond ordinary life. Nothing about these practices survives in written form. There are no hymns, priestly titles, or carved instructions. The people who raised the stones left no explanation beside them. Archaeologists must work from arrangement, context, dating, and comparison. This makes the evidence unusually vulnerable to exaggeration. A stone circle can quickly become an observatory in popular retellings. A cattle burial can become proof of a forgotten religion supposedly passed unchanged into pharaonic Egypt. The reality is more interesting because it is less certain. Some of the clearest ritual evidence comes from cattle placed in prepared pits. These animals are not simply butchered and discarded among food refuse. Their treatment suggests deliberate selection and formal burial. In an environment where cattle represent nourishment, mobility, labor, status, and reproductive wealth, removing an animal from ordinary use is a significant act. It consumes resources and collective effort. The burial may have commemorated a death, renewed a social bond, marked a seasonal gathering, or linked the animal to ancestors and water. No single explanation fully accounts for every example. Cattle are particularly suited to symbolic importance in pastoral societies. They move with people through drought and rain. Their condition reflects the success or failure of seasonal decisions. They reproduce slowly enough to make each animal valuable. Yet a large herd can support public feasting and displays of generosity. The animal becomes part of the social world. It can embody continuity, prestige, obligation, and the ability of a community to survive across difficult country. Later Egyptian religion also gives cattle powerful meanings, but resemblance does not prove a direct, unbroken line from Nabta Playa to dynastic cults. Cattle symbolism appears in many societies because the animals are economically and socially important. It is possible that some desert traditions contributed to later Nile Valley practices, but the path would have passed through centuries of migration, exchange, reinterpretation, and local development. What survives in the record suggests influence is more likely to have been diffuse than simple. The stone structures raise similar questions. At Nabta Playa, upright slabs, circular arrangements, alignments, and buried stones indicate that people invested labour in creating durable features. Some stones may have been transported from a distance. Their placement transforms open ground into organised space. A landscape once defined mainly by water and pasture acquires fixed points that remain when tents, fires, and footprints disappear. This permanence matters. A mobile community does not need stone architecture in order to possess strong attachments to place. Precisely because people move, certain locations can become unusually important. A seasonal basin may serve as a meeting point for groups who spend much of the year apart. Stones can identify where ceremonies occur, where animals are buried, where ancestors are remembered, or where particular lines of sight matter. The structures make social memory visible. Some alignments have been interpreted as references to the sun and the seasonal cycle. One frequently discussed small stone circle may have marked the approximate position of the summer solstice sunrise, or helped organize expectations about the arrival of rains. In a region dependent on monsoon patterns, attention to the sky would be practical as well as symbolic. People observe where the sun rises, how shadows shift when certain stars appear, and how these patterns relate to changes in weather, plants, and animal behavior. Yet the phrase astronomical observatory can suggest a level of precision and institutional science that the evidence does not securely demonstrate. The original positions of stones may have been disturbed. Dating individual features is difficult. Some proposed alignments may occur by chance, while others may reflect broad directional symbolism rather than measurement. Scholars still debate which structures were intentionally oriented and what those orientations meant. The caution does not diminish the achievement. Formal astronomy is not required for people to possess a sophisticated seasonal calendar. Repeated observation over generations can reveal dependable relationships between the sky and the landscape. A rising point on the horizon can help mark a recurring part of the year. A star's appearance before dawn can signal changing seasons. Such knowledge may be carried in stories, ceremonies, remembered routes, and the timing of communal gatherings rather than written tables. At Nabta Playa, celestial observation may have been woven into ritual life. The beginning of rains, the filling of a basin, the movement of herds, and the renewal of pasture are not separate events. Together they determine whether the community can gather and whether animals will survive. Marking the season could therefore mean marking social renewal. The sky does not merely tell time, it becomes part of a system connecting water, cattle, ancestors, and collective identity. Large gatherings would have provided the setting in which such meanings were reinforced. People arriving from different routes bring animals, food, raw materials, and information. Households that live apart for much of the year come together. Partnerships are renewed. New alliances form. Skilled individuals demonstrate knowledge or authority. Ceremonies create a sense of belonging larger than the small travelling group. Temporary gatherings can be socially complex even without permanent buildings. Water access must be managed. Herds must be separated or combined. Food must be distributed. Space must be organised. Ritual actions may require coordination and agreed rules. Some people may lead ceremonies or remember the correct sequence of events. Others may control valuable animals or access to distant exchange routes. Influence develops through performance, knowledge, generosity, and inherited reputation. Archaeology cannot easily reveal whether this influence becomes formal leadership. There are no palaces and no clear royal graves. The communities remain far from state organization, but ritual gatherings can create conditions in which differences of prestige become visible. A household able to provide animals for a feast or burial displays resources. A person responsible for seasonal knowledge may gain authority. A lineage associated with a well or ceremonial place may claim special status. The surprising point is that social scale can increase without permanent settlement. Hundreds of people do not need to live together all year to share symbols, rules, and obligations. They can assemble seasonally, create collective works, then disperse. Their society exists partly in movement and partly in the expectation of return. The gathering place becomes a centre even when it is empty. This pattern complicates the old idea that villages must come before ritual centres. In some regions of prehistory, ceremonial investment may help bring communities together before dense, permanent settlement develops. At Nabta Playa, the exact sequence remains debated. But durable ritual features clearly belong to a world still shaped by mobility. Monumentality begins on a small scale, not as a royal command but as repeated communal labour. The stones themselves are modest compared with the later Egyptian monuments. They do not resemble pyramids, and there is no evidence that their builders possessed architectural knowledge directly transmitted to Giza thousands of years later. Yet they express a principle that will become familiar in Egyptian history: the use of enduring materials to stabilize memory in a changing landscape. Stone outlasts grass, water, tents, and human bodies. It gives form to relationships that might otherwise vanish. The desert makes this endurance especially powerful. A lake fills and disappears. Pasture spreads and withers. Camps appear, then are erased by wind. Against this instability, an upright stone remains. It tells returning groups that others were here before them, and that the place still carries meaning. The exact story may be lost, but the act of returning keeps the memory alive. For generations, this system can survive as long as water returns often enough. People gather, animals are honoured or sacrificed, stones are approached, and the sky is watched for seasonal signs. But the rhythm grows harder to maintain when dry episodes lengthen. A ritual centre without water cannot support large assemblies. A sacred route may become impossible for cattle. Memory can preserve the importance of a place, but memory cannot refill a basin. The desert communities do not abandon their traditions in a single moment. Some remain, some alter their routes, some carry practices and stories elsewhere. Others may disappear into new social groups whose identities no longer preserve the old names. The evidence does not allow one line to be followed clearly from these gatherings to later Egypt. It shows instead how human communities invest meaning in the landscapes that sustain them, and how those meanings must change when the landscape begins to fail. The stones remain beneath the open sky, but the people who placed them face a narrowing world. The rains become less dependable. Lakes contract. Familiar grazing zones lose their resilience. What had once been a wide network of habitable basins begins to fragment, and communities must decide which routes can still be trusted. The next transformation does not arrive as a single catastrophe. It comes as repeated disappointment: a pool that dries too early, a well that yields less water, a pasture that does not return, and a horizon that grows more desert with every generation. The failure of the rains is not announced by a single black horizon or one final storm that never returns. It is experienced in smaller losses. A lake fills less deeply than before. Grass appears later. A familiar route becomes longer because one water source can no longer be trusted. Herds arrive at a basin already weakened. Fish disappear from pools that once lasted through the dry months. People may not know that they are living through a continental shift. They know only that old expectations are beginning to fail. The drying of the Sahara unfolds over centuries and varies greatly from one region to another. Central areas can become arid, while parts of northeastern Africa remain more resilient under the influence of Mediterranean weather and the Nile. Some basins recover after drought, others shrink permanently. Recent environmental records make clear that desertification is not a clean line moving across a map. It advances, pauses, reverses locally, and then advances again. This unevenness shapes the human response. There is no single exodus in which all desert communities abandon their homes and move toward the Nile at once. Some groups remain near dependable wells. Others shift southward toward regions where pasture lasts longer. Some turn more frequently toward oases or the river corridor. Families and communities split, merge, and alter their seasonal circuits. The transformation takes place through countless decisions made under local pressure. At first, adaptation may require only a change in timing. A group leaves a basin earlier than usual. Herds are moved before grass is exhausted. A gathering is shortened. A distant spring becomes part of the annual route. But as dry years become more frequent, temporary adjustments begin to reshape the entire pattern of life. Journeys lengthen. Water sources become crowded. Animals must travel farther between grazing areas. Places once occupied every year may be visited only occasionally, then remembered only in stories. The knowledge that made desert life possible does not suddenly become useless. It becomes more valuable and more difficult to apply. Knowing where groundwater lies matters most when surface water disappears. Understanding animal behavior matters most when pasture fragments. Alliances matter most when several groups depend on the same well. Yet knowledge cannot create rain. There is a limit beyond which even the most skilled community must move or accept severe losses. Cattle make this pressure especially visible. A herd represents food, continuity, prestige, and reproductive wealth, but it also multiplies the demand for water. During prolonged drought, people may reduce herd size, divide animals among different routes, or concentrate near the few surviving sources. Such strategies can preserve part of the herd while changing social relationships. Ownership, access, and obligation may become more important when animals can no longer be supported everywhere. The archaeological record rarely shows the emotional weight of these choices. A declining number of animal bones may suggest reduced occupation. An abandoned well may indicate that groundwater became unreachable. A site with fewer hearths may reflect smaller gatherings or shorter visits. These clues reveal behavior, but not the uncertainty surrounding it. The people living through the change do not know whether the rains will return next year or whether a dry cycle has become the new normal. Some places retain ritual significance after their practical value declines. Stones remain where communities once gathered. Cattle burials endure beneath the surface. A basin can continue to matter in memory even after it becomes difficult to reach. People may return for ceremonies, ancestral obligations, or seasonal meetings long after permanent or repeated residence is no longer practical. Eventually, however, symbolic attachment must compete with the simple need for water. The drying environment also changes the geography of contact. When habitable zones shrink, movement becomes concentrated along fewer corridors. Oases, springs, lake margins, and river valleys draw people from wider areas. This can intensify exchange. It can also create competition. Communities carrying different traditions encounter one another more frequently. Pottery styles, animal practices, tools, rituals, and food strategies may be borrowed, rejected, or combined. The Nile becomes increasingly important within this narrowing world, but it should not be imagined as an empty refuge waiting for desert migrants. People already live along its channels, wetlands, and floodplains. They fish, hunt, gather, and move through riverine landscapes shaped by seasonal flooding. New arrivals or more frequent visitors enter an occupied environment. The future population of Egypt emerges from interaction among these groups, not from the replacement of one population by another. The river itself is not perfectly stable. Flood levels vary, channels migrate, wetlands expand and contract. Local conditions differ between Upper Egypt, the Faiyum region, the Delta, and areas farther south toward Nubia. Yet compared with the drying basins of the Western Desert, the Nile offers something increasingly rare, a recurring source of water that does not depend solely on local rain. This relative reliability changes the balance between mobility and settlement. In the desert, survival often requires moving towards scattered resources. Along the river and round persistent lakes, food can be drawn from overlapping environments. Fish, water birds, wild plants, game, and eventually crops and domesticated animals can be combined. A community does not need to abandon movement entirely, but it can return more often to a smaller area. Environmental evidence from Faiyum shows how gradual and locally delayed this drying can be. The region does not simply follow the central Sahara into aridity at the same moment. Mediterranean influences and the Nile help sustain water longer. Even so, from roughly 5,900 years ago, the amount of Nile water entering the Faiyum system declined significantly. Lake conditions change. The water body becomes smaller and shallower, and at times more saline. Such changes affect people using the lake margins. Shorelines move, sometimes exposing land and sometimes making familiar access points less useful. Fishing opportunities shift. Grazing zones change. Storage areas or camps established near one shoreline may later stand far from water. Communities must adapt not only to a drying climate, but to a landscape whose useful edges move from generation to generation. This is why the story of settlement cannot be reduced to a simple march from wandering to farming. Many communities continue to combine several ways of living. They plant crops but still fish extensively. They keep livestock but still hunt. They use storage without remaining in one place all year. The categories later used by archaeologists hunter-gatherer, herder, farmer, villager overlap in daily practice. Drying may encourage greater reliance on cultivated plants and managed animals because these resources can be planned. But agriculture also creates new risks. Crops depend on suitable soil, moisture, and timing. Herds require pasture and water. A poor flood can damage fields just as a drought harms desert grazing. The move toward food production is not an escape from environmental uncertainty. It is a different negotiation with it. The social consequences are equally important. More dependable locations attract repeated occupation. Repeated occupation makes storage more worthwhile. Stored food allows people to remain longer and creates goods that can be controlled, exchanged, or inherited. Wells, fields, grazing access, fishing places, and storage areas become increasingly connected to household identity and social authority. None of this happens automatically. Environmental pressure does not create civilization by itself. Many societies respond to drought through dispersal rather than concentration. Some maintain mobile lifeways for millennia. Others disappear from the archaeological record without producing larger settlements. Climate changes the range of possibilities, but human choices determine which possibilities are pursued. What the drying Sahara does create is a long movement toward dependable corridors. The wide green spaces of earlier millennia contract into islands of opportunity. Desert routes remain important, and pastoral communities continue to cross them. But the Nile, the Faiyum basin, the delta margins, and the oases grow more central to survival and exchange. People who once met beside temporary lakes now encounter one another more frequently near enduring water. They bring with them different experiences of the older landscape knowledge of cattle, pottery, wild plants, wells, seasonal movement, ritual gathering, and distant roots. These practices do not arrive as one package, and they are not inherited from one people. They accumulate through contact. Along the river, they meet fishing traditions, wetland knowledge, imported crops, and new forms of settlement. The desert does not empty completely, and the Nile does not absorb everyone. Yet the balance has changed. A world once spread across lakes and grasslands becomes increasingly focused around water that returns predictably. The communities adapting to this change are not yet subjects of a king. They are learning instead how to live closer together, how to combine different economies, and how to return to the same places often enough for those places to become something more than camps. As the old basins fade behind them, the river ceases to be only one option among many. It becomes a refuge, a meeting ground, and eventually the narrow stage on which Egypt's many regional traditions begin to recognize one another. The Nile does not become a refuge because it is gentle. It becomes a refuge because, in a drying world, it remains. Its floods can be destructive, its channels can shift, and its wetlands can be difficult to cross. But the river returns with a regularity that the shrinking desert lakes can no longer match. For communities accustomed to moving between uncertain water sources, that difference is profound. The Nile offers not complete safety, but a recurring pattern around which life can be organized. Along its banks, the landscape is far more varied than the narrow green strip visible in modern images. The river divides into channels, feeds marshes, leaves pools behind after floods, and creates islands of fertile ground. Reeds crowd the shallows. Fish move through seasonal waters. Birds gather in enormous numbers. Wild plants grow along disturbed banks and wetland margins. Beyond the floodplain, dry terraces and desert edges provide stone, grazing, hunting grounds, and routes linking the river to oases and distant regions. People already understand this environment in detail. They know where fish concentrate as waters retreat, where birds can be trapped, where edible plants ripen, and where higher ground remains dry during floods. Some communities may spend much of the year near the river. Others approach seasonally from the desert or move between several ecological zones. The Nile is not one continuous settlement. It is a chain of local worlds, each shaped by channel, flood level, soil, vegetation, and access to neighbouring regions. As more people depend on the river corridor, contact intensifies. Communities with different pottery traditions, tool-making practices, animal strategies, and ritual customs meet more often. Some arrive from the western desert, others have long histories in the valley, the delta, Nubia, or the eastern margins. Connections with the Levant bring domesticated plants, animals, and technologies through routes that remain difficult to reconstruct in detail. No single population supplies all the ingredients of later Egyptian society. The river encourages this mixing because it is both a resource and a route. Boats, rafts, and simple watercraft can move people and goods more efficiently than overland travel across broken desert. Even before large vessels appear, the current links communities over long distances. Stone, shells, pigments, animal products, food, and crafted objects can travel beyond the place where they originated. Ideas move with them, often leaving no direct archaeological trace. Seasonal flooding creates one of the most important opportunities. As water spreads across low ground, it deposits sediment and renews soils. When it retreats, damp earth can support plant growth with less dependence on local rainfall. Early cultivation along the Nile is not yet the vast, centrally managed agriculture of dynastic Egypt. Fields are small, techniques vary, and many communities still rely heavily on fishing, hunting, gathering, and livestock. Yet the floodplain allows food production to become increasingly predictable. Predictable does not mean easy. A flood that rises too little may leave fields dry. One that rises too high may damage camps or storage areas. Channels may cut through familiar ground. Mosquitoes, waterborne disease, dangerous animals, and spoiled food remain constant threats. The river supports dense life because it concentrates resources, but concentration also multiplies risks. Living near dependable water requires new forms of timing and cooperation. Communities must decide where to place shelters above the flood, where to store food, and when to sow or harvest. Animals need grazing that does not destroy crops. Fishing must be coordinated with changing water levels. Paths and landing places must remain accessible. A household can manage some of these tasks alone, but repeated occupation encourages agreements among neighbours. Boundaries, access rights, work schedules, and seasonal expectations begin to matter more. Storage becomes especially significant. In a mobile camp, carrying capacity limits how much can be kept. Near repeatedly used sites, grain, dried fish, seeds, tools, and other supplies can be placed in pits, baskets, jars, or built structures. Storage helps communities bridge periods of scarcity, but it also creates something worth controlling. Food that remains after immediate consumption can support future planting, exchange, feasting, or people engaged in activities other than food collection. This does not instantly create social classes. Many early storage systems may be communal or household-based. The evidence rarely reveals who had the right to open a pit or distribute its contents. Still, stored resources change social possibilities. A household with surplus can gain influence through generosity. A group that controls access to fertile ground or a productive fishing place can negotiate from a position of strength. Seasonal abundance begins to acquire a longer social life. The Nile corridor also favours repeated construction. Light shelters can be rebuilt in familiar places. Hearths return to the same areas. Work zones develop around grinding, butchering, pottery production, and tool repair. Refuse accumulates. Burials may be placed near or beyond living areas, tying communities to the ground through ancestry. A site used repeatedly begins to carry history in layers, even if its inhabitants still move during part of the year. What survives in the record suggests that settlement exists on a spectrum. Some locations may be occupied for long periods, others serve as seasonal camps, fishing stations, storage zones, herding stops, or ceremonial places. The distinction between village and temporary site is not always obvious because repeated short visits can leave dense remains. Scholars still debate how permanent many early communities truly were. Faiyum illustrates this difficulty. Older interpretations often imagine clear farming villages established beside the lake. Later research has shown a more dispersed landscape of activity. Sites around the basin contain evidence for crops, livestock, fishing, hunting, storage, and movement. But not all were necessarily inhabited year-round. Communities may have circulated between lake margins, grazing areas, fields, and resource zones while returning regularly to favoured locations. This mixed economy is not a sign of incomplete farming. It is a rational response to environmental variety. Fish can provide large quantities of food when catches are good. Wild plants reduce dependence on one crop. Livestock convert marginal vegetation into useful products. Cultivation provides food that can be planned and stored. Combining all of them spreads risk. Animal bones from Faiyum show how important fish remain even after domesticated animals and crops appear. This challenges the old story of a sudden agricultural revolution replacing everything that came before. Along the Nile and its connected lakes, food production grows within an existing world of fishing, gathering, hunting, and seasonal movement. Older skills do not disappear. They are reorganized. The same is true of desert knowledge. Communities living closer to the river still depend on routes beyond the floodplain. They seek flint, pigments, shells, minerals, grazing, and contact with distant groups. Herders may move animals away from cultivated areas during certain seasons. Traders cross desert corridors that remain dangerous but valuable. The Nile becomes more central without making the surrounding deserts irrelevant. As population and activity increase, local identities become more visible. Pottery forms differ, burial customs vary, tools and ornaments reveal regional preferences. Some communities orient themselves toward the delta and the eastern Mediterranean. Others maintain stronger links southward into Nubia or westward into the desert. Later political unity should not be projected backward onto this mosaic. The river connects people, but it does not erase difference. The delta presents its own challenges. Thick sediments and shifting channels have buried or destroyed many early sites, making its prehistoric record less visible than that of Upper Egypt. This absence can create the false impression that cultural development happened mainly in the south. In reality, northern communities such as those associated with Merimde and later Maadi participate in important networks of farming, exchange, and settlement. Their contribution is simply harder to recover. Upper Egypt offers different conditions. The floodplain is narrower, settlements cluster closer to desert margins, and cemeteries often preserve well in dry ground beyond cultivation. This preservation will later make places such as Badari, Naqada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos especially prominent in archaeological narratives. But prominence in the record is not the same as exclusive importance in the past. For generations, the Nile corridor remains a meeting place rather than a unified country. People fish beneath the same seasonal skies, cultivate similar crops, and keep many of the same animals, yet their communities remain locally organized. Authority may rest with households, elders, ritual specialists, successful herders, or individuals able to command labor and exchange. There are leaders, but not yet pharaohs. The decisive change is cumulative. Dependable water encourages return encourages storage encourages investment in place, investment strengthens claims to land, ancestry, and resources. Repeated contact expands exchange. Larger gatherings reveal differences in wealth and influence. None of these processes leads inevitably to a state, but together they create conditions in which larger and more permanent forms of organization become possible. The river has become a refuge, but it is also becoming a corridor of concentration. Human lives that once unfolded across broad Saharan routes are increasingly drawn into closer proximity. Desert knowledge, wetland skill, imported crops, managed animals, pottery, storage, and ritual practice begin to overlap within the same landscapes. The result is not yet Egypt, but the scale of possibility has changed. Along the lake margins of Faiyum and in early settlements farther north and south, communities begin testing how much of life can be anchored to one place without giving up the flexibility that sustained them for millennia. Their houses remain modest, their fields limited, and their movements seasonal. Yet each storage pit, grinding stone, animal enclosure, and rebuilt shelter gives the riverbank a little more permanence. The refuge is becoming a home. A home beside the river is still not necessarily a permanent village. The earliest farming communities of Egypt live within a world where movement remains useful, where lake levels shift, and where food comes from many sources at once. Their settlements do not resemble the dense towns of later dynastic times. Houses are small, storage is often hidden below ground, and the boundaries between domestic space, work area, seasonal camp, and repeatedly used gathering place remain uncertain. Yet these modest locations mark a profound change. People are beginning to shape the same ground year after year. In the Faiyum basin, the old shoreline becomes a zone of intense activity. Communities establish camps and work areas near water, cultivate cereals, keep domesticated animals, fish on a large scale, hunt wild species, and collect plants from the surrounding landscape. Archaeologists once described some of these places as straightforward farming villages. More recent investigation has complicated that picture. Sites such as Com W and Com K may belong to a broader system in which people move among fields, fishing grounds, storage areas, grazing zones, and temporary residences rather than occupying one compact settlement continuously. This does not make the communities less settled or less innovative. It shows that becoming a farmer does not require abandoning mobility. A household can plant grain in one location, store food nearby, move animals to seasonal pasture, and spend part of the year closer to productive fishing areas. The landscape itself encourages this flexibility. Lake margins advance and retreat. Flood conditions vary. Fish are plentiful at certain moments. Grazing improves in one zone while declining in another. Rather than place every activity in one village, people spread their work across several connected places. One of the most revealing features of Faiyum is the use of storage pits and silos. Grain placed below ground can survive beyond the harvest and provide seed for the next planting season. Storage turns food into something that links one year to another. It allows a community to plan beyond immediate consumption and gives households a stronger reason to return to the same location. A pit filled with grain is also a claim. It ties labour, memory, and expectation to a particular patch of earth. The archaeological remains of these storage areas have sometimes been treated as proof of dense, permanent villages, but the relationship is not so simple. People can store food in places they visit seasonally. In fact, dispersing storage away from living areas may protect supplies from pests, fire, or theft. The exact social rules surrounding the Faiyum stores remain unknown. Some may belong to individual households, while others may be shared by larger groups. The evidence remains incomplete because baskets, wooden covers, and other organic materials rarely survive. Crops entering Egypt include wheat and barley traditions ultimately connected to Southwest Asia. But their adoption is not a story of imported farming replacing local life overnight. Seeds, techniques, and perhaps people move through long networks linking the Levant, the Delta, the Fayyum, and regions farther south. Local communities select what works within Egyptian environments. They combine cultivated cereals with fish, wild plants, hunting, and livestock. The new economy is assembled rather than copied. Animal remains make this mixture especially clear. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs appear in varying proportions. But fish often dominate the deposits at Fayyum sites. Nets, traps, spears, baskets, or other fishing equipment may have been used, though many such objects leave little trace. Seasonal catches could provide large quantities of protein and perhaps food suitable for drying or smoking. A community with access to fish does not need to depend entirely on its harvest, reducing the danger of crop failure. Livestock add another layer of flexibility. Sheep and goats can exploit vegetation unsuitable for humans. Cattle carry social value as well as food. Pigs thrive in wetter environments and around settlement refuse, though their management differs from that of herding animals. Keeping several species spreads risk because each responds differently to drought, disease, and changing pasture. It also creates daily obligations. Animals must be watered, watched, moved, and kept away from crops. The labour of village life is therefore not confined to fields. Grain must be sown, harvested, threshed, ground, and stored. Fish must be caught and processed. Herds must be managed. Pottery must be produced or acquired. Stone tools require maintenance. Houses and shelters need repair. Fuel must be collected. Water must be carried. The rhythm of life becomes tied to overlapping seasonal calendars, each demanding attention at a different moment. Farther north, Merimde offers another view of early settled life. Located near the western edge of the delta, the site preserves evidence for repeated occupation: houses, hearths, storage facilities, tools, pottery, and food production. Its position connects it to riverine resources, agricultural land, desert margins, and routes toward the eastern Mediterranean. Thick delta sediments have hidden many comparable sites, making Merimde unusually important for understanding communities whose archaeological visibility is otherwise poor. The houses at Merimde are modest, often reconstructed from post holes, mud, reeds, and lightweight materials. Their exact form changes through time, and not every structure can be interpreted with certainty. Some appear oval or rounded, while later phases may show more substantial rectangular forms. These buildings do not create urban streets. They form clusters of domestic activity where cooking, storage, craft work, and animal management take place close together. A lesser-known detail is that early village space is often far less orderly than later reconstructions suggest. Houses may be rebuilt over older surfaces. Refuse accumulates near work areas. Pits cut into earlier deposits. Animals move through domestic zones. Wind and flood disturb abandoned structures. What appears on an archaeological plan as a neat collection of shapes represents many episodes of construction, repair, abandonment, and reuse, rather than one frozen moment. At El Amari, near the eastern side of the Nile Valley south of the delta, another early community leaves evidence of shelters, pits, food processing, cultivation, and domesticated animals. Its location near routes connecting the Nile with the eastern desert gives it access to both riverine resources and wider exchange networks. Like Faiyum and Merimde, it should not be treated as an isolated birthplace of Egyptian farming. Each settlement belongs to a larger pattern of experimentation taking place in different environments. These communities share certain practices without becoming culturally identical. Pottery styles differ, house forms vary. Burial customs are not the same everywhere. Some groups depend more heavily on fishing, others may emphasize livestock or cultivation. Local resources shape local choices. The result is not one Neolithic culture spreading uniformly across Egypt, but a series of regional traditions connected by exchange and movement. Burial near settlements begins to bind the living more closely to place. At some sites, the dead are interred within or beside inhabited areas rather than removed to large, separate cemeteries. These burials create a landscape where ancestry and domestic life overlap. A household returning to the same ground may live near those who occupied it before. The exact beliefs remain unknown, but repeated burial strengthens the claim that a place belongs to more than the present generation. At the same time, village life creates new tensions. Stored grain can be stolen, animals damage fields, access to water or productive land can be disputed. A poor harvest affects households unevenly. Some families may possess larger herds or better exchange connections. Others may control specialized knowledge, storage facilities, or access to distant materials. The earliest signs of inequality do not always appear as palaces or spectacular graves. They can begin in small differences of security and influence. Still, these settlements are not miniature kingdoms. Leadership is likely local, flexible, and tied to households or community reputation. There is no evidence that Faiyum, Merimde, or El Omari rules a broad territory. Their importance lies elsewhere. They show how food production, storage, repeated construction, burial, animal management, and exchange become woven into everyday life long before centralized authority appears. The desert has taught people to move with uncertainty. The river and lake margins now teach them how to invest in place without surrendering flexibility. A family may still travel, herd animals, fish seasonally, or visit distant partners, but it returns to storage pits, rebuilt shelters, familiar fields, and ancestral ground. The landscape begins to accumulate obligations. Over generations, these obligations deepen. More labor is invested in pottery, tools, houses, fields, and stored food. More memory is attached to specific places. Communities become increasingly capable of supporting specialists, organizing larger gatherings, and maintaining networks beyond immediate subsistence. Yet the path toward political complexity remains uneven. Some settlements remain small or disappear. Others become part of broader regional traditions whose influence grows. In Upper Egypt, one such tradition begins to leave unusually fine pottery, carefully furnished burials, personal ornaments, and evidence of exchange reaching far beyond the local valley. The villages remain modest, but their cemeteries reveal that people are no longer entering the earth with equal quantities of wealth. Along the margins of Badari, differences that may have existed quietly within daily life begin to become visible among the dead. The dead at Badari reveal differences that daily settlement remains reluctant to show. Houses, hearths, and work areas are modest and often poorly preserved, but cemeteries survive in the dry ground beyond cultivation. There, bodies are placed in carefully prepared graves, wrapped or covered, accompanied by pottery, tools, ornaments, baskets, animal products, and other belongings. Some graves contain little. Others hold objects that require unusual skill, distant materials, or considerable labor. The contrast is not yet the architecture of kingship, but it suggests that social standing is becoming more visible, more durable, and more closely tied to material display. The Badarian tradition develops in Middle and Upper Egypt, especially around the Badarian cow regions, during the 5th millennium BCE. Its exact chronology remains debated. Some dating systems place the best confirmed phase mainly between about 4,400 and 4000 BCE, while broader official chronologies extend the tradition back toward 5500 BCE. This difference does not imply two separate Badarian worlds. It reflects the difficulty of building precise timelines from old excavations, uneven samples, and radiocarbon results gathered under different conditions. The communities themselves are not a single kingdom. They do not appear to be governed from one capital, and there is no evidence of a unified Badarian ruler controlling Upper Egypt. A more cautious picture is of small farming and herding communities sharing related pottery styles, burial customs, technologies, and exchange networks. Their cultural similarities may reflect regular contact, movement, intermarriage, and shared practices rather than centralized political authority. Daily life still depends on a mixed economy. People cultivate cereals, keep livestock, fish, hunt, and gather plants according to local opportunity. Their settlements are probably composed of lightweight structures, storage areas, hearths, and work zones that are easily damaged or erased. The river continues to provide fish and fertile ground, while desert margins supply grazing, stone, and routes toward distant resources. Mobility has not disappeared. Herds may still move seasonally, and exchange draws people far beyond their immediate villages. Badarian pottery is among the most recognizable achievements of this period. Many vessels are thin-walled, carefully formed, and highly polished. Some have dark upper surfaces contrasting with reddish bodies, a result of controlled firing conditions rather than simple painting. Producing such vessels requires knowledge of clay preparation, shaping, drying, fuel, airflow, and temperature. A small change during firing can crack the pot or destroy the desired surface. The finished object therefore represents practiced skill and repeated experimentation. The elegance of this pottery can be misleading if it is treated merely as decoration. Vessels serve practical roles in cooking, storage, serving, transport, and ritual. Their shape and finish may also communicate identity. A particular style can mark membership within a community or region. Fine vessels placed in graves may express respect for the dead, display the resources of a household, or signal the person's social position. The same object can be useful in life and symbolic in death. Some Badarian objects reveal technical experimentation beyond pottery. Early copper items appear, though metal remains rare and does not replace stone tools. The presence of copper is significant because the material must be obtained through exchange or travel to mineral-rich regions. Working it requires knowledge different from flint knapping or pottery production. These small pieces are not evidence of an industrial metal economy, but they show that communities are willing to adopt difficult materials whose value may be partly practical and partly prestigious. Glazed or faience-like objects also appear among early Egyptian traditions, demonstrating an understanding of how mineral-rich surfaces can be transformed by heat. Even when the surviving pieces are small, their bright appearance would have distinguished them sharply from wood, leather, bone, stone, and ordinary clay. Colour itself may carry value. Blue-green surfaces can evoke water, vegetation, vitality, or rarity, although later Egyptian symbolism should not be projected backward too confidently. Personal ornaments make social identity visible on the body. Beads are made from shell, bone, stone, and other materials. Some originate locally, while others imply connections across deserts or along the Nile. Necklaces, bracelets, Pendants, combs, pins, and cosmetic equipment may distinguish age, household, status, or ceremonial role. Because textiles and many organic materials decay, the surviving ornaments represent only part of how people presented themselves. One lesser-known feature of Badarian craft is the extraordinary precision of some flint tools. Thin blades and carefully shaped pieces require control over stone fracture that can take years to master. Flint remains essential even after copper appears because it can produce edges sharper than many early metal tools. Skilled knappers transform raw nodules into knives, scrapers, points, and specialized implements. Their work reveals that technological change is not a simple ladder in which one material immediately replaces another. Craft skill may itself become a source of status. A potter capable of producing unusually thin vessels, a flint knapper known for fine blades, or a person connected to distant materials possesses knowledge that others value. It remains uncertain whether such specialists work full-time. Most probably participate in farming, herding, or household labor as well. Yet the increasing quality and standardization of certain objects suggests that some individuals devote considerable time to mastering production. Exchange networks expand the social world of Badarian communities. Shells can arrive from the Red Sea. Stone and minerals travel from desert sources. Certain materials may come from regions farther south or north. These objects do not prove organized long-distance trade under elite control. They may pass gradually from group to group through gifts, visits, marriages, seasonal meetings, or small-scale barter. Even so, their movement demonstrates that villages are not isolated. The person who controls a distant connection may gain influence without possessing formal office. Access to rare stone, shell, pigment, or metal can strengthen a household's reputation. Gift exchange creates obligations. A valuable object may carry the memory of a journey or alliance. When placed in a grave, it removes wealth from circulation while making social difference publicly visible. Around 600 Badarian graves have been recorded in the wider Badarikau region, though excavation quality and documentation vary. Most graves are simple pits. Bodies are usually placed in contracted positions, often on one side, accompanied by selected goods. The treatment of the dead shows shared conventions, but no two graves are exactly alike. Differences in pottery quantity, ornament quality, tools, and rare materials suggest that some individuals or households possess greater resources than others. The meaning of these differences remains debated. Richer graves do not automatically prove hereditary classes. A person might receive more goods because of age, personal achievement, ritual role, family affection, or the circumstances of death. Archaeologists must also consider preservation and excavation bias. Organic goods disappear, and older excavations may have recorded spectacular objects more carefully than ordinary ones. Still, repeated patterns across cemeteries make it difficult to dismiss inequality entirely. Death provides a stage on which communities express how they understand social identity. A funeral gathers the living, redistributes food and labor, and reinforces relationships among households. Grave goods may honor the deceased, but they also communicate with the mourners. A finely made vessel placed beside a body tells those present that this person, family, or lineage commands skill and resources. Burial turns temporary reputation into a durable statement. Cemeteries also bind communities to territory. Each grave creates an ancestral claim beyond the living settlement. People cultivating nearby land or returning seasonally encounter the resting places of earlier generations. the cemetery becomes a map of memory. Even if houses are rebuilt or abandoned, the dead remain fixed. This gives local identity a depth that mobile life alone cannot provide. The relationship between settlement and cemetery may therefore help stabilize communities along the Nile. Fields, storage, livestock, and houses connect people economically to place. Graves connect them emotionally and socially. Leaving becomes more difficult when the land contains ancestors, obligations, and claims recognized by neighbors. Permanence grows not only from food production, but from memory. Yet Badarian society is still relatively small in scale. There are no royal monuments, administrative records, fortified capitals, or clear evidence of armies. Wealth differences are visible, but they remain modest compared with the elite burials of later Naqada communities. Authority may still be negotiated through kinship, age, skill, exchange, ritual knowledge, and control of livestock rather than enforced by institutions. What changes during this period is the visibility of hierarchy. In earlier desert camps, prestige may have emerged through generosity, herd ownership, or ritual leadership, but much of it leaves only faint traces. At Badari, material distinctions become more consistent. Fine craft, rare goods, and burial display begin to separate some people from others in ways that can survive archaeologically. This does not mean that inequality follows a smooth, inevitable path toward kingship. Communities can resist concentration of wealth, status can disappear with the death of an individual, networks can collapse. Rich graves may appear without producing permanent political power. The evidence remains incomplete, and social organization probably differs from village to village. Still, the Badarian world creates conditions later elites will expand dramatically. Skilled production can be sponsored. Rare materials can be controlled. Funerals can display power. Cemeteries can legitimize claims through ancestry. Exchange can strengthen particular households. Small differences, repeated over generations, can become inherited advantages. Along the Nile, these advantages are beginning to connect with larger networks. Pottery styles travel farther. Desert routes carry valued materials. Communities in Upper Egypt exchange ideas with regions to the north, south, east, and west. The world of village craft and local status is widening into a world of regional competition. Badarian graves preserve the moment before political power becomes unmistakable. Their pottery still fits in the hand. Their copper objects remain small. Their settlements are fragile. Yet beside the dead, a new language is forming, the language of distinction, craftsmanship, rarity, ancestry, and display. In the centuries that follow, communities associated with Naqada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos will speak that language on a far larger scale. The language of distinction expands rapidly in the Naqada world. Fine vessels, rare stones, carved palettes, ivory objects, decorated knives, ornaments, and elaborate graves no longer appear only as local expressions of status. They circulate within a widening network that links Upper Egypt to the Delta, Nubia, the eastern and western deserts, the Red Sea, and regions of Southwest Asia. Communities remain rooted in particular landscapes, but their ambitions increasingly reach beyond them. Naqada is not one city ruling Egypt from the beginning. The name refers both to an important site in Upper Egypt and to a broad archaeological tradition that changes over several centuries. Naqada 1, 2, and 3 are modern chronological labels, not political eras recognized by the people who lived through them. Bayesian dating has suggested that the main sequence may have unfolded over roughly 7 centuries, making the transformation from regional communities to early state organization faster and more compressed than older chronologies once implied. During the early Naqada phase, communities continue many practices visible in the Badarian world. They cultivate crops, keep animals, fish, hunt, produce pottery, and bury the dead in desert-edge cemeteries. Yet settlements become larger in some regions. Craft traditions grow more specialized, and differences among graves become more pronounced. Certain individuals receive objects whose materials, workmanship, or quantity place them clearly apart from ordinary burials. The expansion of exchange is one of the strongest forces behind this change. Upper Egypt lies near routes leading into the eastern desert, where people can obtain hard stones, pigments, minerals, and access toward the Red Sea. Other routes reach westward into former Saharan landscapes and southward toward Nubia. The Nile connects these corridors to communities farther north. Goods can move by boat, by pack animal, or through repeated transfers from one group to another. Gold becomes especially important. Deposits in the eastern desert and Nubia place Upper Egyptian communities near sources of a material that is visually striking, durable, and difficult to obtain. Gold does not yet dominate political symbolism in the manner familiar from dynastic Egypt, but access to it can strengthen elite display. The material catches light, resists decay, and distinguishes its owner from those whose ornaments are made from more common stone, shell, or bone. Other imported materials reveal equally long connections. Obsidian may arrive from distant volcanic sources through complex exchange chains. Cedar and resins from regions to the northeast become increasingly desirable. Shells travel from the Red Sea. Lapis lazuli, whose ultimate source lies far beyond Egypt, appears in later pre-dynastic contexts through networks so extensive that no single traveller need have crossed the entire distance. Each material carries the prestige of rarity and the invisible labour of movement. The arrival of foreign goods does not mean foreign control. Communities adopt, imitate, and reinterpret objects according to local needs. A vessel shape associated with Southwest Asia may be reproduced in Egyptian clay. Imported symbols can be altered until they serve new meanings. Technology spread without populations being replaced wholesale. The evidence suggests interaction rather than a simple story of one advanced region teaching another. Naqada pottery makes this process visible. Early vessels often emphasize polished red surfaces and painted designs, while later wares include pale backgrounds decorated with boats, animals, human figures, standards, and abstract motifs. These images are not straightforward illustrations of daily life. They may encode movement, ritual, identity, landscape, or social rank. Their meaning remains debated because the people who painted them left no explanatory text. Boats appear frequently, sometimes large enough to suggest collective transport or ceremonial importance. The Nile makes boat travel practical, but the painted vessels may represent more than ordinary movement. A boat can carry goods, people, animals, and ritual objects. It can link distant communities and display the capacity to organize labor. In later Egyptian belief, boats become central to royal and divine journeys, but direct continuity from every pre-dynastic image should not be assumed. Animal imagery also becomes increasingly charged. Powerful wild creatures, desert animals, birds, cattle, and composite beings appear on pottery, pallets, knife handles, and rock surfaces. Some may signify regional groups, protective forces, hunting prestige, or control over dangerous nature. Others may belong to stories now entirely lost. What survives suggests that political symbolism is emerging through images before formal writing can record royal claims. At Hierakonpolis, one of the most important Upper Egyptian centres, the scale of activity becomes particularly striking. The settlement extends across a broad area and includes domestic zones, industrial installations, cemeteries, ceremonial spaces, and evidence of specialized production, pottery kilns, brewing facilities, animal remains, and craft areas indicate that some activities are occurring beyond the needs of individual households. Brewing provides a revealing example. Beer is not merely a drink, it is food, a stored form of grain, and a resource suitable for gatherings and labor support. Large production installations suggest the ability to process significant quantities, perhaps for ceremonies, feasts, workers, or elite-sponsored events. The exact organization remains uncertain, but production at this scale implies coordination, fuel supply, grain access, containers, and people able to manage repeated batches. Feasting may help ambitious leaders convert surplus into loyalty. A person who can provide food and drink to a large gathering demonstrates access to resources and the ability to mobilize others. Generosity creates obligation. Ceremonies draw people together, while the host's status becomes inseparable from the event. In this way, surplus does not need to be hoarded to produce power. It can be distributed publicly and remembered socially. Craft specialization strengthens the same process. Fine flint knives, carved ivory, stone vessels, decorated pottery, beads, and cosmetic palettes require time and expertise. Some crafts depend on imported raw materials. If elites control access to those materials or sponsor skilled workers, they can shape both production and display. The object becomes evidence not only of craftsmanship, but of the network behind it. At Naqada, Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and other centres, cemeteries reveal growing differences in wealth. Elite graves become larger and more carefully constructed. They contain greater quantities of pottery and more exotic goods. Some burials may include animals or objects associated with ceremonial power. Ordinary graves continue beside them, making inequality visible within the same community. This growing hierarchy is not uniform. One centre may rise while another declines. Local elites compete through exchange, ritual, production, and burial display. Some traditions spread because they are politically influential. Others may spread because their pottery, technologies, or symbols are widely admired and copied. Archaeologists cannot always distinguish between conquest, migration, imitation, and peaceful integration. Naqada too sees the material culture associated with Upper Egypt extending northward. Pottery, burial customs, and elite symbols appear in areas previously dominated by different northern traditions. This expansion has sometimes been described as the cultural conquest of Egypt by the south, but the evidence supports a more complex process. Communities in the Delta and Nile Valley interact, merge, resist, and adapt. Local northern centres remain important, and exchange with the Levant intensifies rather than disappears. Maadi, near the southern delta, illustrates this northern complexity. Its communities maintain strong links with Southwest Asia and use forms of architecture, pottery, copper, and trade distinct from those farther south. Maadi is not simply a passive culture waiting to be absorbed. It participates in its own networks and occupies a strategic position between the Nile, the Delta, Sinai, and the Levant. As Naqada influence moves north, some Maadi-associated traditions decline or are transformed. Whether this reflects population movement, elite takeover, economic competition, changing trade routes, or gradual cultural blending remains debated. No single explanation fully accounts for every site. The process probably differs from region to region. The same caution applies to the south. Nubia is not merely a source of gold and exotic goods for Egypt. Communities there possess their own political traditions, cattle economies, cemeteries, crafts, and exchange networks. Interaction includes trade, migration, rivalry, and perhaps conflict. But the relationship changes through time. Later, Egyptian claims of southern domination should not be projected backward into every predynastic encounter. The widening networks of Naqada create both opportunity and vulnerability. Elites depend increasingly on access to distant materials and transport routes. A disrupted connection can weaken status. A rival center that controls a river crossing, desert road, or production zone can gain advantage. Political power becomes tied not only to land and food, but to movement. Boats, workshops, cemeteries, feasts, and imported objects all point toward a society operating at a larger scale. Yet there is still no single Egyptian state. Regional centers compete and cooperate. Leadership is becoming more durable, but it remains rooted in local communities and ceremonial authority. Symbols of domination appear before institutions capable of enforcing domination across the entire country. The most important transformation may be the creation of a shared elite language. Powerful individuals in different regions increasingly use similar objects, images, burial forms, and ceremonial practices to express authority. Even when they are rivals, they begin to communicate through recognizable symbols. A decorated knife, a large grave, a boat procession, or a rare stone vessel can announce status across cultural boundaries. This language allows political influence to travel farther than any one person. Objects carry ideas of leadership. Ceremonies demonstrate hierarchy. Pottery images repeat themes of movement, animals, standards, and control. Over time, these symbols become more standardized, preparing the ground for a visual system in which rulers can present themselves as masters of people, land, and cosmic order. The Naqada world is therefore not simply richer than the Badarian one. It is more connected, more competitive, and more capable of converting exchange into authority. Local prestige is becoming regional power. The Nile is becoming an artery through which goods and symbols move in both directions. Desert routes bring materials that help distinguish elites, while elite demand keeps those routes active. Along these networks, Egypt begins to imagine itself before it becomes politically united. Its communities remain diverse, but their leaders increasingly participate in a common world of display, ritual, and competition. The images painted on vessels and carved into valuable objects are still silent. Yet they are moving towards something new, a visual language capable of naming power before writing fully learns how. Before writing becomes a system, power already speaks in pictures. Across predynastic Egypt, animals, boats, standards, human figures, hunting scenes, processions, and ritual objects appear on pottery, carved palettes, ivory handles, stone vessels, and rock surfaces. These images do not yet form the fully developed hieroglyphic script of the pharaohs, but they create a visual world in which authority, identity, landscape, and belief can be recognized without a sentence being written. The meaning of individual scenes is rarely certain. A painted boat may record travel, commemorate a ritual journey, identify a community, or represent movement between human and sacred realms. A wild animal may symbolize danger, territory, divine force, elite hunting, or political domination. A standard raised above a vessel may mark a group or institution, but its precise name is lost. The evidence remains incomplete because the people who made these images did not leave explanations that modern readers can recover. Even so, repetition matters. The same kinds of creatures and gestures appear across different objects and places. Powerful animals are restrained, confronted, or arranged symmetrically. Boats carry emblems and groups of figures. Human beings are shown larger than others or placed at the center of action. Dangerous forces are controlled. Disorder is organized. Long before royal inscriptions announce that a king has defeated enemies and restored order, Predynastic imagery is already exploring the visual grammar of command. Cosmetic palettes provide one of the clearest paths into this world. Early examples are often simple stone forms used for grinding pigments, perhaps for application to the face or body. Over time, some palettes become larger, more elaborate, and increasingly ceremonial. Their practical function does not disappear entirely, but display overtakes utility. A household object associated with preparation and appearance becomes a surface on which elite messages can be carved. This transformation reveals how power often develops through familiar things. A ruler does not need to invent an entirely new object if an existing one already carries social meaning. By enlarging it, decorating it, and placing it in ritual contexts, elites can turn ordinary practice into political symbolism. The same process affects decorated knife handles, ceremonial mace heads, ivory objects, and stone vessels. Useful forms become vehicles for memory and authority. Animals dominate much of this imagery because they offer a language of qualities. Lions suggest force, bulls suggest power and aggression, falcons command the sky, crocodiles belong to dangerous water, desert creatures occupy the margins beyond cultivated land. Yet later, Egyptian religious identities should not be projected backward too directly. A falcon in a predynastic scene is not automatically the fully formed god Horus, and a bovine image is not necessarily the later goddess Hathor. Symbols change meaning as societies change. What can be said more safely is that people organize their world through contrasts. River and desert, tame and wild, fertile and barren, human and animal, local and foreign, order and threat all appear as meaningful categories. These contrasts are not merely artistic. They reflect daily life in a landscape where cultivated fields lie beside wilderness, where boats connect communities but floods can destroy them, and where animals provide wealth while wild creatures remain dangerous. Rock art in the eastern and western deserts adds another layer. Images of boats, animals, hunting, and human activity appear far from major settlements, often along routes linking the Nile with mineral zones, wells, and the Red Sea. Dating individual scenes can be difficult because styles overlap and expose surfaces weather unevenly. Some images may belong to mobile desert communities, others to travelers from the Nile Valley, and still others to later periods. The presence of boats in desert rock art is especially intriguing. These vessels are carved where no river flows, suggesting that the image carries significance beyond literal location. A boat may identify travelers from the Nile, commemorate a journey, claim a route, or transform the desert passage into part of a wider ritual geography. It may also reflect the importance of boats as symbols of organized movement and collective labor. Building and operating a substantial boat requires timber, rope, construction knowledge, and a coordinated crew. The Nile then allows that vessel to carry people and goods over distances that would be far more difficult on foot. A leader associated with boats can move resources, assemble followers, visit distant communities, and display power publicly. In painted and carved imagery, the boat becomes a symbol of connectivity itself. Standards mounted on boats or carried in processions may represent communities, territories, cult emblems, or elite institutions. Some forms resemble later symbols associated with Egyptian districts or deities, but the connection is rarely straightforward. Standardization probably develops gradually as local signs become more widely recognized. The important shift is that identity begins to appear in portable visual form. Once an emblem can identify a group, it can travel beyond that group's home territory. It can be displayed during exchange, ritual gathering, competition, or conflict. It can distinguish one procession from another. It can also survive the person who carries it. Symbols therefore extend authority through space and time, allowing political identity to become less dependent on face-to-face recognition. The human figure changes as well. Earlier images may show groups without clear hierarchy, but later scenes increasingly emphasize scale and position. One figure may tower above captives, animals, or attendants. This use of relative size does not reflect physical reality. It expresses importance. The larger body announces social rank, transforming visual proportion into political meaning. Such conventions will become central to dynastic Egyptian art, where kings are often shown larger than other people, and where scenes are arranged according to status rather than natural perspective. Their roots lie in the predynastic experimentation with how authority should look. By the time writing appears, many of the visual assumptions of kingship are already established. Violent imagery also becomes more common in elite objects, though it should be interpreted carefully. Captives, bound figures, defeated bodies, weapons, and powerful animals may represent actual conflict, ritual performance, symbolic domination, or a mixture of all three. These scenes do not prove that every community lives in constant warfare. They show that the ability to defeat or control enemies has become an important claim of leadership. In a competitive landscape of expanding centers, such claims carry practical force. Control of exchange routes, fertile land, labor, livestock, and raw materials can generate rivalry. Leaders who organize defense or successful raids may gain status. Yet imagery exaggerates by design. A ceremonial object presents the world as elites wish it to be seen, enemies subdued, dangerous animals mastered, followers ordered, and resources gathered under one authority. This visual simplification is politically useful. Real societies are complicated, full of negotiation, resistance, local identities, and uncertain boundaries. Images can erase that complexity. They can present political domination as natural and complete, even when actual control remains partial. Long before royal inscriptions, propaganda already exists in symbolic form. Toward the end of the predynastic period, small signs begin appearing on tags, pottery, vessels, and other objects. Some may record ownership, contents, places, institutions, or quantities. Scholars still debate when these signs become true writing rather than isolated symbols. Writing is not created in a single moment. It emerges as marks are used more consistently to encode information that must be transmitted accurately. Administration provides a strong reason for this development. Expanding elites need to track goods, labor, tribute, storage, and exchange. A symbol that merely represents prestige is not enough when jars must be identified, shipments distinguished, or institutional property marked. Marks become more standardized because political and economic systems require reliability. The earliest writing in Egypt therefore grows from the same world as elite symbolism, craft specialization, and long-distance exchange. It is not separate from the rise of power. It helps make larger organization possible by allowing information to travel without depending entirely on memory. A label attached to goods can preserve identity after the person who packed them has gone. A sign can connect a distant storehouse to an authority elsewhere. Yet writing does not instantly replace images. The two systems remain deeply connected. Egyptian script will continue to use recognizable forms from the natural and material world, while royal art will communicate through scale, gesture, animals, standards, and ordered scenes. The boundary between picture and word remains fluid. This is one reason pre-dynastic objects feel both familiar and mysterious. Their boats, animals, and dominant figures anticipate later Egyptian art, but their stories cannot be read with certainty. They belong to a period when meanings are becoming shared but have not yet been fixed by centuries of royal tradition. Each object stands between local memory and national symbolism. The most powerful communities increasingly use this visual language to claim more than wealth. They claim the right to organize people, control movement, define outsiders, and represent order itself. Such claims require audiences. Ceremonial objects are displayed, buried, deposited, exchanged, or placed in important settings where others can see and remember them. Symbols make authority portable, but cemeteries make it permanent. As elite images become more ambitious, elite graves also grow larger and more carefully separated from ordinary burials. The same leaders who present themselves as masters of animals, enemies, and roots begin to build power around ancestry and the dead. Political control is no longer expressed only through what a person possesses in life, but through what a lineage can preserve after death. Power becomes more durable when it is no longer attached only to the living. A successful leader can command labor, distribute food, control exchange, or dominate a ceremony, but personal influence is fragile. Illness, age, rivalry, or death can end it. For authority to survive beyond one lifetime, it must be transferred into something more permanent, a lineage, a place, a ritual, a symbol, or a claim that the dead continue to support the living. In late pre-dynastic Egypt, cemeteries become one of the principal arenas where this transformation takes place. The grave is no longer simply a place of burial. It becomes a public statement about who mattered, what relationships endured, and which families possessed the resources to turn memory into architecture. Most people are still buried in relatively modest pits, often with a limited selection of pottery, tools, ornaments, or food offerings. Beside them, however, larger and more elaborate graves begin to appear. Some are divided into chambers, some contain greater quantities of goods. Others occupy prominent areas within cemeteries that are used repeatedly over generations. Size alone does not prove kingship. A large grave may belong to a wealthy household head, ritual specialist, successful trader, or regional leader. Archaeologists rarely know the exact title or political role of the person buried within. Yet when differences in grave construction, location, and contents become consistent, they reveal a society in which inequality is no longer temporary or accidental. Certain people are being separated from others even in death. This separation requires labor. A grave must be dug, lined, roofed, furnished, and protected. Goods must be collected or produced. Food and drink may be prepared for ceremonies. Participants must gather, perhaps travelling from neighbouring settlements. The burial, therefore, demonstrates the deceased person's social network as much as personal wealth. A large funeral proves that someone can still mobilize people after life has ended. The most elaborate cemeteries appear near rising centers such as Hierakonpolis and Abydos. At Hierakonpolis, the elite cemetery known as HK6 contains unusual burials, substantial tombs, ritual installations, and carefully treated animals. The site lies apart from ordinary habitation, creating a landscape devoted to ceremony and high-status memory. Some graves are associated with posts, fences, or structures that may have defined special precincts. The exact reconstruction remains debated because wood, matting, and mud architecture survive only as traces. Animal burials at HK6 add to the sense of exceptional display. Cattle, dogs, elephants, baboons, wild cats, and other species have been found in elite funerary contexts. Some animals were difficult to acquire or maintain, and their presence implies long-distance connections, specialized care, or the ability to command dangerous and unusual creatures. The burials may represent companionship, sacrifice, prestige, ritual symbolism, or elite control over the natural world. No single explanation fully accounts for every species or context. An elephant buried near powerful individuals communicates something very different from an ordinary food offering. It suggests access to landscapes beyond the immediate settlement and an ability to capture, transport, manage, or symbolically claim an animal associated with extraordinary strength. A baboon may point towards southern connections or ritual meanings not yet fully formed in the later Egyptian sense. The animals transform the cemetery into a miniature representation of the wider world brought under elite authority. At Abydos, burial grounds gradually become associated with increasingly powerful leaders. The site's importance grows during Naqada III, when large tombs at el-Kab contain numerous chambers, imported goods, inscribed tags, pottery, and evidence of expanding administration. These burials belong near the threshold of dynastic kingship, but they emerge from earlier traditions of elite display, rather than appearing suddenly with the first official dynasty. The desert edge is an ideal location for such cemeteries. It lies beyond the cultivated floodplain, where dry conditions preserve bodies and objects more effectively. It also creates a symbolic boundary between the fertile world of the living and the arid land of the dead. Later, Egyptian religion will develop this contrast into a powerful geography, but its pre-dynastic meaning cannot be assumed to have been identical. What is clear is that burial grounds become enduring landmarks visible from settlements and travel routes. Each new grave strengthens the cemetery's authority. A living leader can point to ancestors already buried there. A lineage can claim that its position is not recent or accidental, but rooted in generations of respected dead. Even where descent is uncertain, proximity to prestigious burials can create legitimacy. The cemetery becomes an archive without writing, recording power through location, architecture, and material difference. Grave goods play a central role in this archive. Fine pottery, stone vessels, ivory objects, flint knives, beads, copper, gold, shells, resins, and imported containers demonstrate access to skilled labor and long-distance networks. Many of these objects are removed permanently from circulation. Burying a rare vessel or finely crafted blade is economically costly, but that cost is part of the message. The family can afford to give wealth to the dead because its resources extend beyond immediate need. This practice may also help elites control valuable goods. Rare materials are not distributed evenly throughout society. They move through routes connected to deserts, Nubia, the Red Sea, Sinai, and Southwest Asia. A powerful household able to organize expeditions, negotiate exchange, or control transport can restrict access to materials that become symbols of status. The object's rarity then confirms the authority that helped make it rare. Craft specialists may become increasingly dependent on elite sponsorship. Producing a carved ivory handle, ceremonial palette, stone vessel, or exceptional flint knife requires time that could otherwise be spent obtaining food. Someone must supply raw materials and support the worker. In return, the finished object enhances the prestige of the patron. This relationship allows powerful households to convert agricultural surplus and trade access into symbols that ordinary families cannot easily reproduce. Funerals provide the occasion to display these relationships publicly. Goods are carried, arranged, broken, deposited, or consumed. Food and beer may be distributed to participants, musicians, ritual leaders, craftspeople, relatives, and followers could all take part, though many details remain invisible archaeologically. The ceremony allows a successor to demonstrate that the deceased person's network remains intact. Succession is one of the central problems of emerging leadership. Personal charisma cannot simply be inherited. A son, daughter, sibling, or chosen successor must persuade others that authority should continue through the same household. Funerary ritual can help by placing the successor at the center of mourning, distribution, and ancestral obligation. The new leader does not claim power only through personal ability, but as the representative of a lineage whose dead occupy prestigious ground. The burial may therefore be as politically important for the living as for the deceased. It gathers supporters, displays wealth, renews alliances, and creates a moment when hierarchy is made visible. Those who receive food or gifts become participants in the continuation of authority. Those who witness rare objects entering the grave see that the household possesses resources beyond ordinary experience. This does not mean every funeral is peaceful or universally accepted. Rival lineages may challenge succession. Communities may resist growing inequality. Graves can be robbed, damaged, or replaced. Some elite centers decline while others rise. The evidence preserves the successful claims more clearly than the failed ones. A large tomb shows that labor was mobilized once, but not necessarily that control remained stable for generations. Still, cemeteries allow power to accumulate. One prestigious burial attracts another. A family's claim strengthens as more ancestors join the same landscape. Ritual specialists preserve knowledge of ceremonies. Craftspeople develop forms intended specifically for elite display. Administrators begin recording goods entering tombs or institutions. What begins as a funeral tradition becomes part of a political system. At Abydos, small inscribed labels and ceilings increasingly connect burial with administration. Goods are identified by source, quantity, owner, or institution. Wine, oil, grain, textiles, and crafted objects arrive from different places. The tomb becomes the endpoint of a network capable of collecting resources across a widening territory. To furnish such a burial, leaders must command more than affection. They must possess organizational reach. The distinction between household wealth and political revenue begins to blur. A powerful leader may receive goods as gifts, tribute, exchange, ceremonial obligation, or taxation in an early form. Archaeology cannot always identify which mechanism is operating. Yet the concentration of materials from many regions suggests that local prestige is becoming territorial authority. Violence may play a role in this process, but it's not the only mechanism. leaders can expand influence through marriage, religious prestige, control of exchange, redistribution, feasting, and protection. Communities may join larger networks because doing so brings access to goods or security. Others may be absorbed under pressure. State formation is not a single conquest, and the evidence does not support one uniform path. The dead help make these unequal relationships appear natural. If a leader's ancestors are presented as founders, protectors, or sacred figures, present authority gains the weight of the past. Political competition can be described as continuity. Recent victories can be transformed into ancient rites. Cemeteries allow power to hide its beginnings. By the final centuries of the 4th millennium BCE, some graves are no longer merely rich. They belong to individuals whose authority reaches across multiple settlements and production zones. Their tombs receive imported vessels, administrative labels, symbolic objects, and offerings gathered by organized labor. The distance between these burials and ordinary graves widens dramatically. The old desert practice of marking memory in enduring places has become something larger. Stones once anchored seasonal gatherings. Graves later tied villages to ancestral land. Now monumental cemeteries support leaders whose claims extend along the Nile. Prestige has learned how to survive death, and in doing so, it has become political. The next struggle will not occur only between individuals. It will unfold among regional centers, each supported by its own elite cemeteries, exchange routes, workshops, symbols, and ancestral claims. Hierakonpolis, Naqada, Abydos, and powerful northern communities are no longer simply different settlements along the same river. They are competing visions of how the river might be organized and of who has the right to command it. The river is becoming politically crowded. By the final centuries of the 4th millennium BCE, power no longer belongs only to respected households, successful traders, or influential ritual leaders. Certain settlements have grown into regional centers capable of drawing resources from surrounding communities, supporting specialized production, maintaining elite cemeteries, and projecting authority beyond their immediate fields and riverbanks. Hierakonpolis, Naqada, and Abydos stand among the most visible southern centers, while communities in the north participate in their own networks around the delta, Maadi, Buto, and other settlements now partly buried beneath later landscapes. These centers do not rise together or remain equally powerful. Archaeology captures a shifting competition rather than a fixed political map. One settlement may dominate craft production for a time, another may control a valuable route, while a third gains prestige through burial and ritual. Their territories are difficult to define because no written boundary lists survive. Influence may extend along river channels, across agricultural districts, into desert corridors, and through alliances with smaller communities whose names are lost. Hierakonpolis appears especially impressive during parts of the Predynastic period. Its broad settlement area includes domestic quarters, industrial zones, ceremonial spaces, and elite cemeteries. Brewing, pottery production, animal management, and specialized craft activity occur at a scale suggesting organization beyond individual households. The center's location gives access to the Nile, desert routes, and connections southward. Yet even Hierakonpolis should not be imagined as a fully developed capital, ruling all Upper Egypt. Its authority likely rises, changes, and competes with that of other centers. Naqada occupies another strategic position near routes crossing toward the eastern desert and mineral resources. Its name later becomes the label for the archaeological culture spreading through much of Egypt. But this does not mean the settlement itself directly commands every community using Naqada-style pottery or symbols. Material culture can expand through imitation, exchange, migration, intermarriage, and political influence without a single city controlling the entire process. Abydos develops a different kind of strength. Its elite cemetery becomes increasingly important, and the leaders buried there appear connected to administrative systems, imported goods, and territories beyond the immediate settlement. By the Naqada III period, Abydos is emerging as a major centre of royal burial and political memory. Its power may have rested partly on the ability of leading families to combine ancestry, ritual authority, agricultural resources, and control over movement along the river. The competition among these centres is not preserved as a clear sequence of wars. Later Egyptian images of rulers striking enemies have encouraged dramatic reconstructions, but archaeological evidence rarely identifies a specific battlefield or campaign. Fortifications, weapons, damaged bodies, and violent imagery suggest that conflict forms part of the political landscape. Yet conquest is only one possible mechanism of expansion. Alliances, marriage, exchange, ritual prestige, and economic dependency can bind communities just as effectively as force. A smaller village may accept the influence of a larger centre because the relationship provides access to imported goods, protection, ceremonial gatherings, or stable exchange. Its leaders may strengthen their own position by participating in the regional system. Over time, local autonomy can weaken without a single invasion. Pottery styles change, administrative practices spread, and elite symbols become more standardized. Political absorption may look archaeologically like cultural convergence. In other places, competition may be direct. Control of landing places, fertile floodplain, desert wells, mineral routes, and livestock corridors give centers practical reasons to challenge one another. A settlement able to restrict passage or redirect exchange can weaken a rival. Raiding cattle or seizing stored grain can damage both wealth and reputation. Yet the scale and frequency of such conflict remain uncertain, and it would be misleading to imagine the Nile Valley in constant warfare. The changing role of Naqada itself may reflect these rivalries. The settlement is highly influential during earlier phases, but Abydos appears increasingly prominent toward the end of the Predynastic period. Hierakonpolis also changes in importance. These shifts suggest that state formation is not the inevitable triumph of one city that has always been dominant. Political gravity moves as leaders reorganize networks and absorb the symbols, crafts, and institutions developed by competitors. Northern Egypt complicates the picture further. Maadi maintains strong links with the Levant and Sinai, giving it access to copper, foreign pottery forms, livestock traditions, and exchange beyond the delta. Its architecture and material culture differ from those of Upper Egypt. Buto, Tel el Farka, Tel el Izwid, Tel el Murra, and other northern sites reveal communities engaged in local production, trade, ritual, and administration. The delta is not an empty region conquered by a culturally superior south. Much of its record is simply harder to see. River channels migrate, floods deposit thick layers of sediment, and later settlement covers earlier sites. Upper Egyptian cemeteries survive in dry desert margins, while northern evidence may lie beneath meters of alluvium or modern occupation. The resulting imbalance can make southern developments appear more complete and decisive than they were. As Naqada-associated material spreads northward, local traditions change. Some vessel forms disappear, new burial customs appear, elite symbols become more uniform. but the process does not erase northern influence. Contacts with Southwest Asia continue and become important to the emerging state. Foreign vessel forms, architectural ideas, seals, commodities, and possibly administrative practices enter Egyptian networks and are reworked locally. This interaction creates one of the hidden contradictions of early unity. The political system that eventually presents Egypt as a self-contained land is built through centuries of external connection. Desert routes, Nubian exchange, Red Sea access, Sinai minerals, and Levantine goods all help strengthen the leaders who claim control over the Nile. Unity is not created by isolation. It is created partly by managing the movement of foreign and regional resources. The same leaders must also manage difference within Egypt. Communities along the river possess their own cemeteries, ancestral claims, pottery traditions, and local elites. A regional ruler cannot simply eliminate all of them without destroying the system that supplies labor and goods. More often, local authority is reorganized beneath a broader hierarchy. Village leaders may become representatives, tribute collectors, ritual participants, or allies within the expanding domain. Administration begins to make this larger scale possible. Seal impressions, inscribed labels, vessel markings, standardized containers, and controlled storage help leaders identify goods and institutions. A shipment can be connected to a place or authority. A sealed container can show that its contents have not been disturbed. Standardized measures and repeated signs reduce dependence on personal memory. These practices are still developing, and their exact meanings are not always readable. A sign interpreted as a place name may instead identify an institution, ruler, estate, or product. Early writing remains difficult to decipher because many examples are brief and isolated. Still, the growing quantity of administrative materials shows that political power now depends on information as well as display. A leader claiming several settlements must know what each can provide: grain, livestock, pottery, textiles, oil, wine, stone, labor, and specialized goods move toward elite households, ceremonial centers, workshops, and tombs. Some are redistributed. Others support workers or followers. Some are buried to glorify the dead. The system does not yet resemble the vast bureaucracy of later Egypt, but its foundations are visible. Ritual also helps hold expanding territories together. Ceremonies can bring local elites into the presence of a more powerful ruler. Shared symbols create a language recognizable across regions. Processions, feasts, offerings, and royal display allow hierarchy to be performed rather than merely imposed. A community may experience the distant ruler through objects, officials, and ceremonies long before it encounters a permanent administrative building. The emerging leader increasingly claims to stand above local rivalries. Instead of appearing as one chief among many, he is presented as the force capable of mastering conflict itself. Enemies are shown as disorder. The ruler becomes the one who binds regions, controls dangerous animals, commands boats, and brings scattered resources into a single ceremonial order. Political expansion is translated into cosmic necessity. This claim is more complete in art than in reality. Boundaries remain unstable. Rival centers may continue resisting. Local identities persist beneath the spread of elite culture. Even after political unification, Egypt will experience rebellion, fragmentation, and renewed competition. The image of effortless unity conceals the negotiation required to maintain it. At some point during Naqada, 3 rulers based in Upper Egypt appear to control increasingly large portions of the Nile Valley and Delta. Their names or emblems survive on labels, vessels, ceilings, and ceremonial objects, but the sequence remains disputed. Some figures belong to the period often called Dynasty Zero, a modern term for leaders who precede the formal First Dynasty. Their relationships are uncertain. They may represent successive rulers, regional rivals, or overlapping lines of authority. The famous image of a final conqueror uniting two lands may therefore compress a longer process. Political consolidation probably occurs through several generations of competition, absorption, alliance, and administrative expansion. One ruler may secure territory already influenced by predecessors. Another may lose regions that a successor recovers. No single event explains the entire transformation. What matters is that the scale of rule has changed. Leaders once dependent on a single settlement now command networks extending across many communities. Goods arrive from distant regions. Symbols of kingship become increasingly standardized. Burial centers gather the wealth of broad territories. Writing begins to identify places, institutions, and rulers. The separate river worlds are being drawn into one political frame. Yet this frame is built from the practices of the communities it absorbs. Desert mobility supplies knowledge of routes and resources. Village storage supports surplus. Pastoral traditions shape wealth and ritual. Regional exchange provides rare materials. Cemeteries legitimize ancestry. Craft specialists create symbols. Local leaders organize labor. The emerging state does not invent these systems. It gathers, enlarges, and redirects them. The competition among Hierakonpolis, Naqada, Abydos, and northern centers therefore leaves a legacy even where one rival disappears from prominence. Their experiments survive within the political structure that follows: workshops, burial customs, administrative marks, ceremonies, and visual symbols are inherited, transformed, and presented as the timeless order of kingship. By the threshold of 3100 BCE, the river is close to being ruled as one land, but unity remains a political achievement rather than a natural condition. It has taken centuries of rivalry to make the idea imaginable. One authority is now reaching across the mosaic of villages, cemeteries, ports, workshops, and desert routes, claiming that all belong within the same ordered world. The pharaoh has not yet fully emerged, but the institutions capable of supporting him are gathering around the throne. The throne gathering at the end of the Predynastic period does not stand apart from the older world. It rests upon it. Beneath the royal symbols, administrative labels, elite tombs, and expanding territories lie practices developed over thousands of years by communities that never knew a pharaoh. The emerging state takes habits formed in seasonal camps, pastoral routes, lake settlements, fishing stations, farming villages, workshops, and cemeteries, then enlarges them until they can serve rulers claiming authority over an entire river valley. Mobility is one of the deepest foundations. Long before officials organize expeditions into deserts, people know how to cross difficult country, locate groundwater, judge distance, and move between the Nile, oases, grazing lands, stone sources, and Red Sea routes. Desert travel depends on knowledge that cannot be improvised from a palace. Guides must understand seasonal heat, animal endurance, hidden wells, landmarks, and the changing condition of routes. The state inherits this human geography. Under royal authority, older paths of movement become channels for organized extraction and communication. Expeditions travel into the eastern desert for stone, minerals, pigments, and gold. Routes southward connect Egypt with Nubia and regions beyond. Sinai offers copper and turquoise. Red Sea corridors lead toward distant coasts. The officials directing these journeys may serve kings, but the practical knowledge belongs to generations of herders, hunters, traders, and travelers who crossed these landscapes before royal institutions existed. Water knowledge undergoes a similar transformation. At Nabta Playa and other desert basins, wells extend occupation beyond the brief life of surface pools. Along the Nile and around Faiyum, people learn to place settlements, fields, storage, and grazing according to changing water levels. They observe floods, shorelines, soils, channels, and seasonal access. These practices do not amount to a centrally managed hydraulic state, and the old idea that Egyptian kingship emerges simply from the need to control irrigation is too mechanical. Local communities can manage water without kings, yet a state ruling many communities can build upon that local experience. Flood conditions must be observed over wider areas. Agricultural production must be estimated. Work on channels, embankments, storage facilities, landing places, and fields can be coordinated beyond one household. Officials can collect information from local leaders and redirect labor toward projects serving elite, ceremonial, or administrative goals. The king does not invent water management. Royal power absorbs it, claims responsibility for it, and presents successful order as evidence of legitimate rule. The same process affects food storage. Early pits and silos connect one harvest to the next and give households reasons to return to particular places. In larger settlements, storage supports gatherings, craft production, herding, and exchange. Under emerging royal institutions, stored grain can become revenue. Goods once retained primarily for household survival can be collected, sealed, counted, redistributed, and used to support officials, craftspeople, expeditions, ceremonies, and labor forces. Taxation probably does not begin as a fully standardized national system. The evidence remains incomplete, and early contributions may take several forms: grain, livestock, manufactured goods, labor, ceremonial gifts, tribute, or obligations negotiated through local authorities. The boundary between voluntary offering and compulsory payment may be unclear. What changes is the scale and regularity with which resources move upward toward institutions associated with powerful rulers. Sealings and labels help make this movement manageable. A container can be marked by source, destination, institution, or owner. A seal can protect stored goods and identify the authority responsible for them. Standardized vessels make quantities easier to compare. Writing, still limited and experimental, begins to preserve information that memory alone can no longer hold. Administration becomes the quiet mechanism through which political claims are turned into material control. Trade networks provide another foundation. For millennia, shells, stone, livestock, pottery, pigments, metals, and ornaments have travelled between communities. Exchange creates alliances and gives certain households access to distant resources. Late predynastic elites expand these networks and increasingly concentrate rare materials in workshops, ceremonies, and tombs. Under kingship, access to valuable goods becomes part of royal prestige and royal strategy. A ruler who commands gold, fine stone, imported wine, exotic animals, cedar, copper, or rare pigments appears connected to a world larger than any village. These goods support ceremonies, reward followers, equip specialists, and distinguish institutions associated with the court. Their movement also requires protection, accounting, boats, storage, intermediaries, and agreements with communities along the route. Trade and administration grow together. Craft production is reorganized in the same way. Village potters, flint knappers, brewers, bead makers, carpenters, metal workers, and stoneworkers possess skills developed gradually within households and regional traditions. As elites demand more standardized and elaborate objects, some craftspeople work in concentrated production areas or under institutional support. Surplus food allows them to spend longer periods away from farming. Royal and ceremonial demand encourages specialization. The state benefits from this concentration of knowledge. Craftspeople produce storage jars, seals, boats, tools, ceremonial objects, weapons, stone vessels, and grave furnishings. Their work materializes authority. A carefully carved pallet or mace head communicates power in ritual settings, while a standardized jar or seal supports the less visible work of administration. The same political system requires both spectacle and routine. Ritual leadership may provide the most powerful bridge between older community authority and kingship. Seasonal gatherings in the desert already bring dispersed groups together around water, animals, memory, and shared ceremony. Village funerals display status and renew alliances. Elite cemeteries connect powerful lineages to ancestors and sacred places. Predynastic rulers inherit these traditions and expand their claims until leadership is no longer presented as merely social or political. The ruler becomes responsible for order itself. His authority is shown through ceremonies that unite territory, ancestors, animals, harvests, enemies, and divine forces within one visual system. Standards, processions, offerings, royal burials, and ritual objects transform political dominance into sacred necessity. A successful leader is not simply stronger than rivals. He is portrayed as the figure through whom the land remains properly arranged. This claim gives kingship a durability that force alone cannot provide. Military success can seize resources or remove competitors, but coercion is expensive and unstable. Ritual makes hierarchy appear legitimate. Administration makes it repeatable. Redistribution gives followers practical reasons to participate. Ancestral burial gives the ruling lineage historical depth. Writing allows institutions to remember beyond individual lives. Warfare nevertheless becomes part of the system. Competition among centers, control of routes, cattle, land, and labor create reasons for organized conflict. Early royal imagery emphasizes captured enemies and the defeat of disorder, though such scenes cannot be read as literal records of every campaign. They show that martial power has become one accepted language of rule. The king claims the ability to protect communities, punish resistance, and extend authority beyond local boundaries. The people mobilized for conflict are drawn from the same communities that provide labor, food, boats, and goods. Administrative organization allows rulers to gather supplies and coordinate groups from multiple settlements. River transport moves people rapidly along the Nile. Local leaders may serve within a larger hierarchy, turning regional loyalties into instruments of expanding power. What began as alliances among communities can harden into obligations to a central authority. Environmental resilience also becomes part of royal ideology. Earlier communities survive because they diversify food, maintain roots, read seasonal change, and preserve social ties across difficult years. The state cannot eliminate drought, poor floods, disease, or local scarcity. It can, however, collect surplus from broad regions, store resources, redirect supplies, organize labor, and present itself as the guardian of stability. Whether early rulers consistently fulfilled this promise is uncertain. Central collection can protect communities during shortage, but it can also burden them. Storage controlled by institutions may serve elites before ordinary households. Royal claims of abundance may conceal local hardship. No single explanation fully accounts for how willingly different communities entered the new system. Some may benefit from wider security and exchange. Others may experience unification as increasing extraction and lost autonomy. This contradiction lies at the center of state formation. The same institutions that coordinate resources can concentrate them. The same administration that preserves information can monitor obligation. The same river network that carries goods can carry officials and soldiers. The same ritual that creates belonging can define outsiders and rebels. Political complexity offers new forms of cooperation, while creating new forms of inequality. By around 3100 BCE, these accumulated practices are converging. Mobility has become expeditionary reach. Shared water knowledge supports territorial administration. Household storage has expanded into institutional revenue. Exchange has become controlled access to distant wealth. Craft skill serves royal demand. Ancestral authority becomes dynastic legitimacy. Regional conflict becomes a royal claim to defend and unify the land. The pharaoh therefore does not emerge from an empty stage, and he does not descend upon scattered communities carrying civilization with him. Kingship is assembled from their knowledge, labor, roots, beliefs, animals, fields, workshops, and dead. The new state gathers what many communities have created, then presents the result as the timeless order of one ruler. The desert remains beyond the floodplain. The old lakes continue to vanish. Wells, pathways, stone arrangements, abandoned camps, village stores, and ancestral cemeteries lie beneath the political landscape now taking shape. Their makers will never appear in king lists. Yet without their long experiments in surviving uncertainty, the throne would have little beneath it. Egypt's first rulers are about to inherit a world prepared not by a forgotten empire, but by thousands of years of human adaptation. Around 3100 BCE, the first Egyptian state emerges into history, but it does not arrive in a single morning. There is no clearly preserved moment when every village along the Nile suddenly agrees that one king rules them all. Political consolidation has already been unfolding through generations of competition, alliance, exchange, ritual expansion, and administrative control. Some territories may have been absorbed peacefully, others through pressure or conflict, and many local authorities probably remain in place beneath the growing royal hierarchy. Unification is less a single event than the point at which one political system becomes powerful enough to present a long, uneven process as a completed fact. The rulers associated with the final Predynastic period and the beginning of the first dynasty inherit a river already connected by boats, trade routes, shared symbols, elite networks, and increasingly standardized administration. They inherit skilled craftspeople capable of producing fine stone vessels, ceremonial palettes, flint knives, pottery, textiles, seals, and metal objects. They inherit communities accustomed to storing grain, managing livestock, organizing labor, and navigating seasonal floods. They inherit cemeteries where ancestry legitimizes authority and ritual centers where political leadership has already begun to take sacred form. Writing appears within this world as an instrument of organization. Early signs on labels, vessels, ceilings, and tags identify goods, institutions, estates, locations, or rulers, although the meaning of many individual marks remains uncertain. The script is still limited, but it allows authority to extend beyond face-to-face contact. A jar can be linked to a distant source. A shipment can be assigned to an institution. A burial can receive goods recorded by origin or quantity. Administration begins to preserve the intentions of people who are not physically present. The royal court takes advantage of this emerging information system. Officials, seal-bearers, record-keepers, craft supervisors, and local representatives become part of a structure that can gather resources from multiple regions. Grain, livestock, oil, wine, pottery, stone, labor, and manufactured goods move through channels of obligation. Some support the ruler's household. Some supply ceremonies and burials. Others maintain workers, expeditions, and administrative centers. The precise nature of the early taxation remains difficult to reconstruct. Contributions may still resemble tribute, gifts, ritual obligations, or seasonal labor rather than the regular assessments known from later periods. Local customs probably vary. What survives in the record suggests that royal institutions are experimenting with ways to turn regional production into dependable revenue. The state is learning how to make distant communities visible through goods, seals, and officials. This new authority is also expressed through ritual images, a ruler wearing distinctive crowns, carrying a mace, controlling animals, confronting enemies, or appearing larger than other figures embodies the language developed during the Predynastic centuries. These scenes do not provide neutral reports. They compress political complexity into a simple claim the ruler stands at the center, while everything around him is ordered, defeated, gathered, or protected. The idea of the two lands becomes especially powerful. Upper and Lower Egypt are presented as complementary parts of one kingdom, joined beneath royal authority. Yet the distinction does not correspond to two completely isolated civilizations suddenly merged by one battle. The valley and delta contain many local traditions, and interaction between north and south has been growing for centuries. Royal ideology transforms that complicated history into a clear symbolic union. Later generations will associate this achievement with named kings and founding events, but the exact sequence remains debated. Archaeological evidence, royal lists compiled much later, and early inscriptions do not always align neatly. Some rulers once treated as legendary may represent memories of real political figures, while others may combine several traditions. Even the identity of the ruler most closely associated with unification cannot be reduced to a simple certainty without ignoring the incomplete record. What matters more than the name of one conqueror is the system that becomes visible. Royal burials at Abydos expand in scale. Administrative materials increase. Goods arrive from broad territories. Officials and institutions leave recognizable marks. Political symbols become more standardized. The ruler's authority extends far enough that communities across the Nile corridor participate in a shared framework, whether willingly, strategically, or under compulsion. The desert communities remain part of this framework. Pastoral groups continue to move beyond the cultivated valley. Expeditions rely on wells and routes known long before kingship. Hunters, miners, stoneworkers, traders, and guides cross landscapes that royal officials may claim but cannot understand without local expertise. The desert becomes a source of minerals, building stone, animals, pigments, and symbolic danger, yet it never ceases to be inhabited and used. The memory of older climatic worlds also survives indirectly. The Sahara is now far drier than during its greenest phases, but routes between oases and former lake regions continue to shape movement. communities displaced or transformed by aridification have contributed traditions of cattle keeping, mobility, ritual gathering, and environmental knowledge to the broader human landscape of northeastern Africa. Their influence cannot be traced as one direct bloodline or cultural inheritance, but neither can they be removed from the story. The Nile villages also retain their importance beneath the new political order. Farmers plant and harvest, fishers work the channels, herders move animals between floodplain and desert edge, potters fire vessels, brewers process grain, families repair houses, bury relatives, and maintain local obligations. The state depends upon these routines, even as royal art directs attention toward kings, ceremonies, and conquest. This creates a fundamental imbalance in the surviving record. The people who build the economic foundation of Egypt leave fewer names than the rulers who collect from it. Administrative systems make ordinary labor measurable without making ordinary lives visible. A seal may record an institution but not the person who filled the jar. A royal tomb may contain hundreds of vessels while preserving nothing about the farmers, potters, boat crews, and carriers who produced and moved them. The disappearance of individual names should not be confused with historical insignificance. The first dynasties endure only because communities continue doing what generations before them learned to do: read the river, anticipate the flood, preserve seed, manage animals, maintain boats, cross deserts, produce tools, exchange goods, and cooperate through seasons of uncertainty. Royal authority organizes these practices on a larger scale, but it does not replace the knowledge embedded within them. The emerging state also inherits inequality. Differences once visible in Badarian graves and Naqada cemeteries become part of a far more pronounced hierarchy. Royal tombs consume enormous quantities of labor and wealth. Elite officials receive privileged burials. Specialized goods concentrate around institutions. The political system creates opportunities for coordination, security, exchange, and public works, but it also gives a small group greater control over resources and memory. This hierarchy is never entirely stable. Early dynastic rulers must travel, perform ceremonies, reward followers, maintain alliances, and respond to local resistance. Unity requires repetition. The kingdom must be enacted through royal journeys, taxation, ritual festivals, burials, seals, officials, and symbols. A map may show one Egypt, but actual authority must be renewed in every region and generation. The evidence remains incomplete concerning how ordinary communities experience this transformation. Some may gain from more secure routes and wider exchange. Others may face heavier demands for grain, labor, or livestock. Some local leaders may prosper by joining the royal administration. Others may lose independence. State formation is both integration and extraction, opportunity and constraint. Yet the durability of the system is remarkable. The forms created near the beginning of Egyptian history, divine kingship, territorial administration, monumental burial, organized labor, visual hierarchy, ritual unity, and written accounting will be adapted repeatedly for thousands of years. Dynasties will collapse, foreign rulers will arrive, provinces will resist, the country will divide and reunite. Still, later governments will return to a political language shaped during this early transformation. The pharaohs inherit more than institutions. They inherit a way of imagining the land. The Nile is presented as an ordered center surrounded by deserts that both protect and threaten it. The flood becomes a sign of renewal. The dead occupy enduring landscapes beyond cultivation. Animals, plants, boats, crowns, and celestial patterns enter a symbolic system connecting political power with the structure of the world. Many elements have roots in earlier practices, but the state gathers them into a new and increasingly controlled vision. This is why the search for a single lost civilization before Egypt leads away from the more compelling story. There was no forgotten empire ruling the Nile 10,000 years before the Pharaohs. There were communities living around seasonal lakes, digging wells, making early pottery, gathering wild seeds, keeping animals, fishing, farming, building villages, exchanging rare materials, burying their dead, and developing symbols of identity and power. Their histories overlap without becoming one history until royal authority begins to claim them all. Nabta Playa contributes evidence of desert adaptation, communal gathering, cattle symbolism, and durable ritual space. Faiyum reveals flexible communities combining cultivation with fishing, herding, hunting, and seasonal movement. Merimde and other northern settlements show that the delta and its margins possess their own traditions and external connections. Badarian cemeteries make growing social difference visible. Naqada networks expand trade, craft specialization, imagery, and elite competition. Hierakonpolis experiments with large-scale production, ceremony, and unusual burials. Abydos turns ancestry, administration, and royal death into foundations of dynastic authority. None of these places alone creates Egypt. Together, and alongside many less visible communities, they form the long field of experimentation from which the state grows. Their contributions are not steps in a predetermined plan. People respond to immediate needs, local opportunities, droughts, floods, rivalries, and relationships. Only from the distance of thousands of years does the path appear to lead naturally toward kingship. For those who lived through it, the future remained uncertain. A farmer storing grain beside a retreating lake did not know that scribes would one day record harvests for a king. A herder guiding cattle toward a desert well did not imagine royal expeditions crossing the same route. A potter polishing a red and black vessel could not foresee the elaborate workshops of the dynastic court. A family placing ornaments beside the dead did not know that royal tombs would later gather the wealth of an entire country. History is built from such unintended inheritances. Knowledge passes forward, changes purpose, and becomes part of systems its earliest users never designed. The well becomes a route station, the storage pit becomes a treasury, the household mark becomes administration, the funeral becomes dynastic legitimacy, the gathering place becomes a center of ritual power, the local leader becomes a king whose image claims to contain the land. And yet, beneath every transformation, the earlier world remains. It survives in the dependence on water, in the movement between river and desert, in the value of cattle, in the authority of ancestors, in the power of stone to preserve memory, and in the need to cooperate when the environment refuses certainty. The first pharaohs stand at the end of this long beginning. Behind them lie thousands of years without royal names, official chronicles, or monumental inscriptions. Ahead of them rise the temples, pyramids, cities, and dynasties that will make Egypt one of the most recognizable civilizations in human history. But the threshold between those worlds is not a wall. It is a landscape crossed slowly by generations. The river continues beneath the evening light, carrying silt northward as it has long before any crown is raised. Beyond the fields, the desert stretches toward vanished lakes whose shorelines can no longer be seen. Wind passes over old hearths, buried wells, fragments of pottery, and stones placed by hands whose intentions are only partly recoverable. The communities themselves are gone, their spoken names, songs, arguments, journeys, and memories have disappeared almost completely. What remains is scattered and quiet, a seed darkened by fire, a fish bone beside an ancient lake, a polished vessel in a grave, a post hole from a shelter, a seal pressed into wet clay. From such small traces, a vast human story returns. It is a story not of a lost empire, but of persistence. People learn a landscape, lose it, and adapt again. They carry knowledge from grassland to desert, from lake to river, from seasonal camp to village, from village to political centre. Their world changes beyond recognition. Yet something of their choices continues in the civilization that follows. The pharaohs will fill the horizon with stone and write their names for eternity. The people before them leave no such promise. Their legacy is less visible, but more deeply embedded. It lives in the systems the kings inherit, in the routes their expeditions follow, in the fields that sustain their courts, and in the belief that human order can be built against the uncertainty of nature. Long after the lakes have dried and the earliest villages have vanished, the Nile still moves through the centre of the land. The water reflects the same sky watched by desert travellers, herders, fishers, farmers, and rulers. For a moment, their separate worlds seem to rest upon the same surface, carried quietly forward before the current closes again,